The beggar king. Varys stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed, even as he saw his fellow councillors shifting in discomfort or, in the case of Lord Mace Tyrell, capitulating completely by sinking into a chair. It was one of those absurdly extravagant chairs that only Lord Tyrell would own, gaudy, far too opulent for the occasion, as expected of the Rose Lord. He owned no shame, or perhaps he had simply mastered the art of concealing it, for he sat with a heavy, satisfied posture, observing the petitioners kneel and grovel before the throne, and the man who occupied it. Lord Paramount Christopher Mudd, the Iron Hand, was a figure to behold, clad in a resplendent black doublet adorned with golden stitching that formed intricate, commanding patterns. Draped across his lap was the sheathed Lady Forlorn, though it had been refitted and renamed, now Torrent. Varys, despite his usual preference for a dagger, couldn't help but admire the new craftsmanship of the blade. The hilt was a thing of beauty, crowned with a 5-pronged design, a nod to House Mudd's coat of arms and the 5 major rivers that traversed the Riverlands. The 3 forks, of course, the Tumblestone, and the Blackwater Rush. Set within the crown was an emerald, one that could very well have come from the royal treasury, though no one would dare voice such a suspicion aloud in this hall. For who could question the Iron Hand, the dragon savior, and his modest gifts in comparison? Queen Dowager Rhaella apparently, if his reports were accurate, but after a brief ceremony with Lord Mudd she and her children had been sequestered back to Dragonstone with a company of gold cloaks for their protection, pushing her off the game board, for now, at least. Varys had, of course, considered the potential advantages of deepening this divide. It was a strategy worth weighing, even if it chafed his pride to find himself serving yet another set of red dragons. This rebellion had unfolded in ways that even he hadn't foreseen. He had seized the opportunity when introduced to the young gold cloak officer, offering assistance where he could and building a rapport almost instinctively, as he always did with rising men of influence in the city. It had become second nature to him, ingrained from years of playing the game. But when Mudd had mobilized the City Watch and marched into the Red Keep, the entire foundation of Varys' carefully laid plans had crumbled. His ambitions for the officer, once a pawn in his grand scheme, had turned to dust. He had been caught utterly off guard, watching in stunned silence as his plot for the dragon's fall unraveled before his eyes, leaving no hope of redemption. It was only the shock of that moment, the disarray it caused, that had prevented him from doing something reckless in the days and moons that followed. His anger had festered in his windowless chambers deep within the Red Keep, the weight of his failure pressing on him as he stewed in frustration after Mudd's swift rise to hand. It wasn't until the dual victories over Baratheon at the Kingsroad and Lannister beneath the very walls of this city that Varys finally chided himself for his earlier, almost childish reaction to his failed plans. Had he truly endured all this torment, the humiliation of serving the killers of his ancestors, only to let a setback drive him into a tantrum? A significant setback, certainly, but far from a permanent one. If there was one thing Varys was certain of, it was that he would find a way to turn the tides in his favor again, as he always had. In his quiet tantrum, Varys had managed to lay low and even end up on the victor's small council. Now, he was not dealing with a mad Targaryen, but a dangerously ambitious man with similarly large boots to fill from his forefathers, just as Varys had. Despite their differing methods, Varys couldn't help but draw parallels between the two of them. Both, at least seemingly, were low-born individuals thrust up to the highest rungs of society, equally feared, revered, and looked down upon. It was a shame, however, that Mudd seemed to be hitching his wagon to young King Aegon, seeking to influence the future monarch for his own gain. Varys recognized the brilliance in Mudd's ambition. Had the child not been a Targaryen, Varys would have wholeheartedly thrown his support behind the man. Together, they would have been unstoppable, the martial statesman and his shadowy ears and daggers, guiding a malleable young king into the greatest ruler the Seven Kingdoms had ever seen. The loyalty and pledge Varys held to his own family rendered such a partnership impossible in the long run. Ultimately, the cruel game of politics always persevered, and the wheel kept turning, indifferent to personal desires. Varys found himself wondering whether Mudd would ever recognize this harsh truth before it was too late, or if he would stubbornly continue on his path, blind to the inevitability of his own downfall. Robert Baratheon had proven a failure, undone by circumstances that tripped Varys' horse mere strides before the finish line. Only a foolish or sentimental man would continue betting on a lame horse simply because it once showed promise. Varys, however, was neither. He wasn't even a man in the conventional sense, so why imitate their follies? The circumstances had changed dramatically since Varys first saw potential in Robert Baratheon and begun his machinations. Lately, he had begun to wonder if a war of some kind would have erupted regardless of his intervention. Aerys Targaryen, after all, was far from a stable man even before Varys introduced a subtle concoction he had discovered in the East into the king's meals. The poison had been a masterpiece of subtlety, its effects nearly undetectable, if one did not know what to look for, of course. Unlike the infamous poisons favored by assassins, it was rarely lethal, even in high and sustained doses. Instead, it dulled the mind, like milk of the poppy but with entirely different characteristics, one so obscure that even the Citadel's highest maesters would have overlooked them. It was perfect for his purposes, sowing instability in Aerys without immediately arousing suspicion. Unfortunately, this careful work had been undone by Lord Tyrell's staffing changes during Mudd's absence on campaign. With a single stroke, the dismissal of every kitchen hand within Varys' influence severed his control over the king's meals. By then, however, Varys had long since lost interest in that particular endeavor. Aerys' death had rendered the effort moot, and while years of meticulous recruiting had gone to waste, the loss was not as devastating as it might once have been. King Aerys' reaction to the concoction had, in any case, proven unpredictable. The Darkland situation, a debacle in which Varys had little to no hand, had only exacerbated the volatility of the king's behavior. Aerys had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to predict or control, even Varys. All this was irrelevant now. Just days before Mudd's return from the Second Battle of the Trident, Varys had received a messenger from his friend Illyrio, bearing news of great significance, the birth of a son. The boy, sired by Illyrio upon Varys' last remaining living cousin, had come into the world with a head of striking platinum blonde hair, a legacy of their shared forebears. Their Aegon, Illyrio had proclaimed in his message. Varys supposed there was a certain poetry to it. If they succeeded, songs would undoubtedly be sung of the Black and Red Aegons. The final victorious Black Dragon, the second conqueror. He was roused from his thoughts as he saw Mudd rise to his feet, raising a hand to signal the end of the session. "This concludes today's court," Mudd declared, his voice carrying through the hall. "May the Seven grant you all safe travels home." Some of the petitioners grumbled, their frustrations left unvoiced, but all bowed deeply before filing out, escorted by gold cloaks. With Mudd's current support, it seemed unlikely for him to fall for quite some time. Sarah couldn't suppress her permanent smile, even as the carriage bumped and jolted along the cobblestones. Tears of joy threatened to spill over, though she fought to keep them at bay. Across from her sat her father, a grin plastered across his face, while her mother sat beside him, visibly nervous yet brimming with excitement. Sarah could hardly recall a time when she had seen her mother wear both emotions so openly. Her mother's unease drew Sarah's gaze downward once more, to the gown she wore, a gift courtesy of the Street of Silk's finest artisans. Christopher had been tight-lipped about the cost, insisting it was nothing for her to worry about. Still, from what she'd gleaned, the gown had come at a nearly criminal discount, granted for her soon-to-be husband's position and his actions in the defense of the city. The whole city seemed to shine with a near-reverent respect and gratitude for her Christopher. Sarah had, of course, read of his exploits in the missives he sent during the war and overheard countless rumors, but seeing the tangible consequences of those actions now opened her eyes to the true weight of his deeds. Christopher was an ambitious man, she had known that from the moment their eyes first met. Sarah was sheltered and naive, she wouldn't deny it. Yet, their letters during his campaigns had been a revelation. While he had rarely delved into the specifics of his schemes, actions, or plans in his writing, his way of thinking had bled through the lines. She had found it fascinating. Many men, she knew, were ruled by emotion, for good and ill. Christopher, however, was something different altogether. His calculating mind, his precision, and his ability to see the bigger picture were unlike anything she had encountered before. It was a new and thrilling world, and she admired it deeply. He was, without question, the perfect husband for her. Christopher lived with purpose, a clarity of ambition that she had been blind to before. But now, she saw it clearly, and she knew she had to rise to meet it. This was why she had ensured her gown was immaculate, her every detail perfect. She would not let him down. She could not. The gown was exquisite, a snow-white masterpiece adorned with swirling mirrorish lace details along the skirts, the delicate patterns mimicking the flowing currents of a river in soft shades of blue. It was designed to highlight her beauty without crossing into crudeness, and it succeeded magnificently. Yet even as she admired its craftsmanship, her thoughts drifted to the maiden's cloak of yellow and black draped over her shoulders. She longed for the moment when she would exchange it for her husband's, leaving behind the curses and tragedies that clung to Harrenhal like an unwelcome shadow. The fates of her brothers were proof enough of its blight. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter, and Sarah was eager to embrace it. She pushed those heavy thoughts to the back of her mind, choosing instead to reflect on the changes the gods had wrought in her over recent years. She supposed no one would have ever called her homely, even as a pudgy-cheeked girl. She had been the fair maiden at their tourney, after all, though she hadn't yet grown into her full form. But now, she had. She had seen the way Christopher looked at her, his desire clear in those piercing blue-green eyes. It seemed the gods, in their mercy, had seen fit to grant her this happiness to balance all they had taken. And yet, despite this, irrational fears would sometimes creep in from the recesses of her mind. Would Christopher find her lacking? Would his desire wane at the sight of her now? Sarah shook her head, chiding herself for even entertaining such foolish thoughts. Today was her day, and nothing, not even her deepest insecurities, would cast a shadow over it. At that moment, the carriage shuddered to a halt, and the buzzing sounds of the crowd outside finally registered in Sarah's ears. Barked commands from the gold cloaks rang out, adding to the commotion. Her heart pounded fiercely as the door creaked open, flooding the dim interior with bright daylight for the first time since their departure from the Red Keep. Her mother was the first to disembark, moving with a grace born of noble upbringing. Her father followed, pausing only briefly to offer Sarah a look of encouragement. She took a shuddering breath, steadying herself as resolve replaced her nerves. Rising from her seat, she stepped out into the sunlight, her gown catching the light and shimmering faintly as she moved. On one side of the stairs descending from the carriage stood her father, hand extended to help her down. On the other side was Sir Desmond Mallister, a man as steadfast as the sigil of his house. Though of a similar age to her father, Sir Desmond carried himself with the strength and poise of a man half his years, a reliable anchor among the Kingsguard ranks. Unlike the younger, freshly appointed knights, Sir Valtries, Sir Jamus, and Sir Jeremy, he exuded a calm, seasoned authority. Sarah placed one hand in her father's, the other carefully lifting her gown to keep it from brushing the ground. Her heart raced, but her steps remained steady as she descended the stairs. The weight of countless eyes on her was unmistakable, their cheers ringing through the air in a wild cacophony that sent a rush of nerves and anticipation coursing through her veins. As a child, she had never been comfortable in large crowds, and even her time in the tourney, though transformative in many ways, hadn't fully prepared her for this. Now, with seemingly half the city gathered to watch her, their exuberance both thrilled and unnerved her. It was a momentous occasion, one that demanded all her composure. Her father suddenly guided her hand to rest on his arm, steering her forward through the parted throng. Gold cloaks formed a shield wall on either side, creating a wide corridor that led straight to the towering, ornate doors of the Great Sept of Baelor. The sight of it took her breath away. Christopher had spared no expense, ensuring that the event would be etched into the memories of all who witnessed it. It had been debated, of course, whether such a grand wedding was necessary, but Christopher had insisted on it as a show of stability and unity. It was not lost on her that they would be the first non-Targaryen couple married within the Great Sept, a space traditionally reserved for royal ceremonies. The decision was bold, even provocative, yet undeniably fitting for the man who had already reshaped the political landscape of the realm. The grand set of doors of Baelor's sept swung open, revealing the breathtaking Hall of Lamps. The entrance chamber lived up to its name, with suspended leaded glass globes in an array of vibrant colors and shades casting a kaleidoscope of light onto the polished marble floors below. The walls, also of marble, gleamed with an almost ethereal light. At the far end stood another set of ornately adorned doors, their intricate carvings hinting at the grandeur of the sept beyond. Sarah's breath caught at the beauty of the hall, but her awe was quickly overtaken by the anticipation of what lay ahead. No crystal, gold, or precious stone could distract her from the moment she had been waiting for, the sight of Christopher waiting just beyond the next threshold. Before she realized it, she was standing beside her father, the two of them positioned before the final doors. Her mother stood a respectful step behind them, her presence a quiet comfort for once. Sarah glanced up at her father, his expression one of profound solemnity and pride as he looked down at her. She met his gaze with a firm nod, her resolve shining through. With that silent exchange, her father turned and made a subtle gesture to the guards stationed at either side of the doors. Without hesitation, they moved into action, their movements deliberate and reverent as they pushed the heavy doors open. The low groan of ancient wood echoed through the Hall of Lamps, accompanied by the gradual shift of light spilling into the cavernous sept beyond. The effect was immediate, a blanket of silence settled over the assembled crowd, any hushed conversations fading into nothingness as all attention turned to the open doorway. Sarah's gaze swept the sept, though her focus narrowed with every passing moment. The high windows and the intricate glass dome above allowed sunlight to cascade in colorful streams across the polished floors. She barely registered the massive stone statues that lined the space, each representing the aspects of the seven, save for two. Her eyes lingered only briefly on the statues of the father and the mother, towering sentinels that flanked the altar where all sacred unions were blessed. And there, standing between them, was Christopher. Everything else seemed to fade away as Sarah's gaze found Christopher. Her heart quickened, and she took in the sight of him. He wore a deep black doublet, rich and expertly tailored, embroidered with golden thread in intricate patterns reminiscent of the rivers that crisscrossed his lordship, the lands they would soon share. The design was subtle yet striking, a perfect fit for the Lord Paramount of the Riverlands. It bore a quiet grandeur, slightly more opulent than what previous Tully lords might have chosen, but then the Mudds were of royal blood. It was only fitting, she supposed. Draped over his shoulders was a golden silk cape, a nod to his service in the city watch, yet elevated in its refinement by the choice of silk over wool. The cape was fastened with a silver brooch shaped like the mud crown, its golden spires gleaming in the light. His dark breeches and polished boots completed the ensemble, understated yet undeniably authoritative, a blend of practicality and elegance. At his hip hung Torrent, the Valyrian steel blade he had recently renamed. Though its faintly red-tinted blade with swirling patterns remained hidden in its sheath, the crown-shaped pommel and embedded emerald stood out, gleaming proudly. Sarah thought the name fitting, a testament to its lord and his domain. Torrent must surely rank among the most valuable Valyrian blades in the realm, though its worth, like all of its kind, was nearly impossible to measure. Only a desperate man or a fool would ever part with one willingly. Christopher stood tall, his posture composed and confident, yet his gaze softened as it settled on her. There was warmth in his eyes, a quiet assurance that steadied her nerves and reaffirmed that she was exactly where she belonged, at his side, ready to face whatever challenges their future might bring. Her thoughts, however, briefly turned to the matter of his bastard son. It was a shadow on her mind, though one she believed she could dispel in time. Once she had provided him with a strong heir to secure his position, the burden of keeping the boy so close might lessen. After all, Christopher was nearly the sole surviving member of his house, and in such circumstances, even natural children were difficult to cast aside. But surely, with their own children, he would feel secure enough to let the boy take a step back. This rationalization allowed her to set the matter aside, at least for now. There were far more pressing things to focus on today. This moment was hers, theirs, a union that would surely prove to be the start of something great. Her father had been steadily guiding her closer to the altar, to Christopher and the waiting Septon, while her thoughts had wandered. They passed row after row of benches, each one filled to capacity with family, friends, lords, ladies, and other prominent figures of the city. Sarah even thought she caught sight of a few delegates from across the narrow sea, undoubtedly here to curry favor with Christopher, though she imagined the same could be said for almost all the other guests as well, bar a few. Finally, they reached the altar. Sarah came to a stop beside her father, her gaze lifting to meet Christopher's before briefly flickering to the Septon. The man offered her a pleasant, polite smile, his demeanor calm and composed. He was a high-ranking member of the faith, though not the High Septon himself. It had been agreed that having the High Septon officiate their wedding would seem far too presumptuous, even for a Lord Paramount and Hand of the King. She suppressed a small smirk, recalling Christopher's remark that the Septon standing before them was one of the favored contenders to succeed the aging High Septon. It was those subtle moves, those small yet meaningful details, that fascinated her most about Christopher. He was neither a pushover nor a brute, preferring compromise and cunning over mindless aggression when solving problems. That balance, she thought, made him truly remarkable. "Now, I do believe the time has come?" the Septon asked, his voice soft yet carrying effortlessly across the chamber, bringing a hush over the room. The stillness was palpable as all eyes focused on them. The Septon looked at her first, a silent question in his gaze. Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly to steady herself. He then turned to Christopher, who inclined his head with equal solemnity. "Wonderful. Blessed be the seven, who have brought you two together," the Septon murmured, his words meant only for their ears. Sarah felt warmth bloom on her cheeks, a faint blush she couldn't suppress. She stole a glance at Christopher, whose small smile was calm and composed. Yet his eyes told a different story, shining with emotions far deeper than his outward demeanor revealed. "Blessed be the seven, who watch over us with their eternal wisdom and grace. We gather here today to unite this man and this woman in holy matrimony, an eternal bond before gods and men." The Septon now addressed all in the room, his words reverberating. The Septon turned to Sarah, his kind eyes resting on her. "Lady Sarah of House Went, do you come here freely and without reservation to join yourself to this man?" "I do," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling within her. The Septon then faced Christopher. "Lord Christopher of House Mud, do you come here freely and without reservation to join yourself to this woman?" "I do," Christopher answered, his tone firm, his gaze unwavering as it rested on Sarah. The Septon nodded, satisfied, and raised his hands in a gesture of reverence. "Then let us honor the gods and continue." He began a series of solemn prayers, his voice resonating through the September 1st. He called upon the Father, beseeching him to bless the union with justice, fairness, and the strength to protect their household. Next, he turned his prayers to the Mother, seeking her blessing for fertility, love, and compassion in their life together. The maiden followed, as the Septon spoke of Sarah's purity and the virtue she carried into this union. Sarah stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, but she couldn't ignore the growing impatience that stirred within her. Though she followed the faith, she couldn't help but question the justice of the gods who had allowed such misfortune to befall her family. How could they be called good when they had seemingly turned a blind eye to her prayers in times of desperate need? These theological musings lingered in the depths of her mind, remnants of countless unanswered pleas that had worn away her once pious heart. Still, she held her composure, her thoughts drifting as the Septon continued to lead the prayers with deliberate solemnity. Finally, he invoked the crone, asking for wisdom to light the way ahead for them. "Crone, with your eternal lantern, illuminate their path. Grant them wisdom in their choices and the understanding to navigate the unknown as they walk this journey together." The prayers concluded, and the Septon lowered his hands. "With the blessings of the seven, we now proceed to the sacred exchange of cloaks, a symbol of love, unity, and protection under the eyes of the gods." Her father stepped to her side, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. He looked deeply into her eyes as he carefully drew the black and yellow cloak from her narrow shoulders, his hand steady but his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Folding the fine fabric with great care, he held it to his chest for a moment, as if saying a silent farewell to the role it symbolized. Sarah offered him a warm smile, a reassurance for him, but also for herself. Her heart swelled with love for the man who had guided her through life, even as she prepared to step into this new chapter under another's care. Her gaze shifted to Christopher, who stood tall and steady, his presence commanding but his expression soft as he looked at her. At his side, his cousin Robin stepped forward, holding a folded cloak on his outstretched arms with a ceremonial precision. The fabric was deep green, adorned with an embroidered emerald-studded crown on the back that shimmered faintly under the light of the September. The edges were lined with fur, not quite the heavy pelts of the north, but neither the light, airy cloaks of the Reach or Dawn. Christopher took the cloak from his cousin with deliberate care, unfolding it as he stepped closer to Sarah. She turned slightly, her head held high, and allowed him to drape it over her shoulders. The weight of the cloak settled around her, heavier than her maiden's cloak but imbued with a comforting warmth. It was not just fabric, it was a promise, a symbol of the protection and partnership she was stepping into. As he adjusted the clasp at her throat, Christopher's fingers brushed against her collarbone, and for a fleeting moment, his hands lingered. He gave her shoulders a slight but firm squeeze, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by others, but it carried a depth of affection and reassurance that left her heart fluttering. They soon turned back to the Septon, who watched them both with a pleased expression. He spoke again. "With this cloak, Lord Christopher takes you, Lady Sarah, under his protection, as husband and wife, bound in the eyes of gods and men." Christopher turned fully to Sarah, taking her hands in his. His voice was low but steady as he spoke the traditional words. "With this kiss, I pledge my love, and take you for my lady and wife." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she responded, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "With this kiss, I pledge my love, and take you for my lord and husband." The Septon lifted his hands once more, his voice strong and resonant. "Before the eyes of the seven, I proclaim you one flesh, one heart, and one soul, now and forever. Let no man or woman put asunder what the gods have joined." Christopher leaned in, and their lips met in a gentle but resolute kiss, sealing their union. The chamber erupted in applause and cheers, the sound echoing joyously throughout the September. The Septon smiled as he concluded, "Go forth as husband and wife, united in love and purpose. May the seven bless and keep you both." Sarah offered the Septon a grateful smile before she and Christopher turned, their hands still joined as they began their walk back down the aisle. The Sept erupted in cheers, the sound echoing off the marble walls, but as her eyes swept over the crowd, Sarah couldn't help but notice the many unfamiliar faces. Smiles adorned most of them, but not all carried the warmth of genuine joy. Some eyes gleamed with something far less wholesome: greed, calculation. The sharks were circling, drawn by the scent of fresh opportunity, believing perhaps that Christopher might be especially charitable in the glow of such happy circumstances. Her gaze flicked to her husband. He wore a brilliant smile, his demeanor exuding confidence and contentment, but Sarah saw the sharp intelligence in his sweeping glances over the audience. He missed little, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of a swordsman gauging an opponent. If these opportunists thought him a young, naive lord, they were sorely mistaken. As though sensing her thoughts, Christopher turned his gaze to hers, and for a moment, the mask slipped. His eyes softened, revealing a blend of happiness, excitement, and a flicker of anticipation. It was a look that made her heart swell with affection and pride. Sarah liked to believe that with her, at least, he would never wear the mask. Perhaps it was naive to think so. He was a man sure to be surrounded by plots and intrigue, after all, but she held on to the hope that their bond would be different, that it would remain untouched by the games of the court. She squeezed his hand gently, returning his smile with one of her own. Their guests began forming a line behind them as they marched out, an unspoken order settling over the procession. Surrounding them were 4 Kingsguard knights, maintaining a respectful distance yet staying well within striking range. Gerald Hightower, Barristan Selmy, Desmond Mallister, and Jamis Blackwood, 2 seasoned veterans of Aerys Reign and 2 younger knights recently sworn to the White Cloaks. Each was a skilled swordsman, though there was a marked difference in their experience and renown. As they emerged from the great sept of Baelor into the sunlight, a deafening roar of celebration greeted them. The crowd outside had grown even larger, a sea of faces cheering and waving banners in the colors of House Mud, House Went, and House Targaryen. Flower petals rained down upon them, carried by the breeze, a cascade of vibrant hues that seemed to bless their path. Christopher lifted Sarah's hand high, a gesture of triumph and unity that was met with even louder applause. She felt her cheeks flush, but this time, it wasn't nerves, it was pride. Standing beside him, she felt not just like a bride but like a queen. And though the realm would never call her that, in her heart, she would be his queen. "Are you ready?" Christopher's voice was low, meant only for her ears. His words carried more weight than they might have seemed to others, for she knew he wasn't simply asking about the next steps of their day. "Always," she replied, her voice steady and resolute. Christopher's smile deepened, and he pressed a kiss to her hand. Then, together, they descended the steps, walking toward the carriage that would carry them to the great feast awaiting them at the Red Keep. 7 bloody hells. Robert Baratheon roared, hurling his wine flagon against the stone wall with a deafening crash. Dark red droplets streaked down the surface like blood as shards of shattered pottery scattered across the floor. A shrill scream pierced the air as the girl, caught mid-dressing, scrambled to gather her clothes. Clutching them to her chest, she bolted from the room without so much as a backward glance. Robert's chest heaved, his breath ragged as his furious gaze bore into the open door. The audacity of it. That wretched harlot, her audacity to demand such an outrageous price for what she dared to call her services. And worse still, that he could not even muster the coin to pay it. He had been the great Stormlord, the Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. In all but name, he had ruled as King of the 7 Kingdoms. How, then, in a single year, had it all slipped through his grasp? Only a year had passed since that cursed second battle of the Trident. At first, the memory of the Trident and that ford had been a comfort, a triumph that fueled his dreams for weeks, visions of himself driving his war hammer into the smug dragon prince's chest, shattering both armor and arrogance. But now, even that moment of glory was soured, the sweetness replaced by the bitterness of all that came after. The second battle, the moment of his undoing, had loomed over him like a storm cloud, inevitable and inescapable. The silver shit, replaced by another smug bastard, this one with a mop of brown hair. How it stung to be bested by him of all people. The memory gnawed at him like an old wound reopened. It had been bad enough at the tourney of Harrenhal, losing in front of lords and ladies, but back then, Robert had told himself it didn't matter. That defeat was one he could laugh off, a momentary stumble against a foe who had relied on trickery, not strength. He'd ignored the whispers swirling afterward, neither confirm nor denying them, theories of dark magic and woods witches, or mutterings of low-born dishonor. He was not one to spread rumors, usually he ended them. This time he had let them be, let it be a lesson for that whelp believing that they never would meet again. There was no excuse he could lean on for the battle. It had been a near-total defeat, leaving him with nothing but his life and a steadily shrinking band of supporters. The sound of hurried footsteps outside his door broke his grim thoughts. 3 brothel guards stormed into the room, weapons drawn. The lead guard leveled his sword at Robert's prone form, still sprawled in the bed. "You will pay, or we'll drag you to the dungeons, drunkard." The guard barked, voice full of disgust. Robert felt his face flush with anger. How dare this low-born scum look at him this way? "Do you have any idea who you're?" The guard cut him off sharply. "I wouldn't care if you were the Triarch himself. Pay, or I'll make sure you never want to step foot in another brothel again." Robert shot up from the bed, but instantly regretted it as the copious amounts of wine and spirits in his system exacted their cruel toll. His vision swirled and blurred, making his limbs feel heavy as he groaned in frustration. Before he could even steady himself, a sword's hilt collided sharply between his eyes. Unconsciousness beckoned, but Robert fought against it, struggling to stay awake. The effort was in vain, as two guards quickly seized both of his arms, their grip unyielding and brutal. His limbs strained against their hold, and for a fleeting moment, delirious in his drunken haze, he imagined he might escape. But then the flat of the first guard's blade struck him across the side of the head with a resounding crack, and his world tilted once more. Robert slumped into a semi-conscious stupor, barely aware that he was being dragged. The sensation of rough wooden planks gave way to the relentless rhythm of stairs, each step a cruel reminder of his helplessness, before he was thrust out into the cold, damp air of the cobblestone street. "Book bastard," he heard through the fog of his mind, his ears still ringing, the world slowly darkening around him. "Do we bother move?" The words faded into nothing as Robert's vision finally dissolved, his mind slipping into darkness, the world around him vanishing entirely. Robert awoke to a sharp poke digging into his exposed side. His eyes fluttered open, and harsh daylight flooded them. As his senses returned, the sounds of a bustling city street began to pierce the haze of his confusion. A man loomed above him, the sun haloing his figure, and Robert immediately recognized the sharp object pressed to his side as a blade. Instinctively, he jerked backward, heart hammering in his chest as the realization of his danger struck him. As he scrambled to orient himself, his gaze swept the surroundings. He was lying in a gutter, soaked through with water and a nauseating mix of fluids of dubious origin. The stench made him gag. Turning his attention back to the stranger, he could now make out the details that had been hidden in the glare of sunlight. The man, unmistakably of Westerosi descent, had not been fortunate when the gods were shaping him. His ears were large and bulbous, his nose prominent and disformed, and his jaw crooked. A patch of balding light brown hair only accentuated the man's otherwise unremarkable features. Yet, despite his unfortunate appearance, the stranger was powerfully built, clearly a warrior clad in full-plate armor adorned with gold baubles, ornaments Robert found oddly out of place on a man dressed for battle. Were they in Westeros, Robert might have called him a knight. But here, in Volantis and the Free Cities, knighthood was a rarity. Few cared for such titles, instead choosing to live by their own codes and traditions, free of the rigid distinctions of the Seven Kingdoms. It was only then that Robert noticed the group of soldiers standing behind the stranger, each one armed and armored, their presence as imposing as the man before him. Perhaps sellswords, if not knights, their attire filled with gold fabric and embellishments left little doubt in Robert's mind about their identity. "Now this is a sight I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams, a beggar king." The man's voice rang out with mocking amusement, and the soldiers behind him burst into uproarious laughter, the sound echoing through the street. Robert's eyes darted between the group of seven, calculating, assessing, wondering how he could save himself from this mess. His mind raced, but the options seemed grim. Worse still, his modesty was only guarded by his stained smallclothes, and his weapons or any valuables were nowhere in sight. They were either stolen or, if he'd managed to hide them, he had no recollection of where. The confusion of his current predicament gnawed at him as much as his growing dread. "You seem to know my identity," Robert said, keeping his tone steady despite the fury bubbling beneath his surface. "May I learn yours?" The leader tilted his head slightly, dark eyes narrowing as he assessed Robert. "I am Sir Miles Toyne, Captain General of the Golden Company. Blackheart to you, though." Robert couldn't help but note the casual pride in his words. So it was a knight after all, at least according to himself. Though, the Golden Company had always been known for its loose interpretation of titles and lineage. It wouldn't surprise him to find a fraudulent knight in their ranks. Before Robert could reply, one of the soldiers stepped forward, his tone laced with mockery. "I thought only your kingdom was stolen." The man gestured toward Robert with a smirk, provoking more laughter from the group. Shame flared hot in Robert's chest, his blood rising, but he fought to keep his composure. He knew the trap was tightening around him. Before he could retort, Blackheart spun on his heel, fury flashing in his eyes. "That's enough, Dick," he snapped, his voice like steel. "Get back in line. If you do not shut your mouth while I'm speaking, I'll have your head rolling at my feet." The sudden shift in tone silenced the others instantly, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Robert's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't dare make a sound. Blackheart turned back to Robert, annoyance clear on his face. "Coles," he muttered, the name dripping with disdain. "Troublemakers, the whole lot of them." The mention of the name sparked something in Robert's mind. He couldn't help but ask, "Like the Kingmaker?" A dark smirk tugged at Blackheart's lips. He shrugged, his gaze shifting toward his men before returning to Robert. "Who knows?" he said, his tone filled with a mix of mystery and indifference. "Right, of course. Now, Robert Baratheon," Blackheart continued, his voice laced with mockery. "It was quite shocking when I heard of the bounty put out for your arrest, or head. Had to come see for myself if the rumors were true. And for once. Well, here you lie." Even though Blackheart's words were mocking, Robert could sense something deeper in the man's gaze. It was clear that the Captain General wasn't truly taking pleasure in his humiliation. There was a calculation at work, a consideration of something more than just a fallen king. Blackheart was sizing him up, weighing options. "Captain General." A shout broke the tense moment, and Robert cursed under his breath as he recognized the lanky, red-headed figure approaching. John Connington. Trailed by a dozen of his own sellswords, Connington dragged with him the last of Robert's retinue, 5 men, battered and bloodied, yet their defiance still flickered in their eyes. Robert hadn't heard from any of his old loyalists in months, and now these 5 were all that remained of his once proud banner. Connington's smug grin twisted as he spoke in mocking jest. "Managed to round up his Kingsguard, and all." Blackheart groaned silently, rubbing his eyes as though trying to stave off a headache. "Well done, John," he said flatly. Connington's smug grin faltered as Robert's unflinching gaze locked onto him. "Well, what in the hells are you staring at?" Connington sneered, his eyes flicking downward with disdain. "Seems you handle drowning better than the last Baratheon lord did." Connington chuckled darkly, but Robert's silence only seemed to fuel his smugness. With a cruel sneer, he pressed on, "Though I suppose young Renly is lord now, so it would be incorrect to call you that. How about King of the Puddle, since the 7 kingdoms are off the table?" That was all it took. Robert surged to his feet, anger flaring like wildfire. The instant he saw the bastard's lips tighten, he acted. The spit struck him square in the face, but it didn't matter. His fist was already in motion, a right hook that cracked against Connington's freckled cheek. The image of striking Prince Rhaegar with his warhammer flashed through his mind in a brief, violent rush. Connington's head whipped around with a sickening snap before his body crumpled, crashing to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been severed. But Robert had no time to savor the moment. Before he could even gather his breath, 2 of the Golden Company's soldiers slammed into him, sending him crashing to the cobblestones. His head struck the stone with a dull thud, the impact sending waves of nausea and disorientation through him, his vision swimming and his thoughts slipping into a haze. "Am I dealing with fucking children?" Blackheart's voice boomed, filled with raw fury that sliced through the fog in Robert's mind. His frustration hung thick in the air. "Get them both up, now." A grunt escaped Robert's lips as 2 soldiers seized him, hauling him upright by his armpits. His legs wobbled, barely supporting his weight. He caught a glimpse of Connington, who hung limply between 2 other men, his head drooping in unconsciousness. The sight sparked a brief, primal satisfaction in Robert, making his lips twitch in a fleeting, cruel smile. That was until a sharp cuff to his head from one of the soldiers snapped him back to his grim reality. He groaned as pain shot through his skull, his vision swimming again. Blackheart shook his head in exasperation, clearly dismissing Connington entirely. "Cut that out." The soldier who'd struck Robert nodded dutifully, though he shot Robert a spiteful look, which he barely registered, too weary to care. The Captain General then fixed his full attention on Robert. His gaze stern but with a glint, annoyance certainly, but also admiration. "You struck one of my officers." "No, hold on." Blackheart raised a hand, silencing Robert before he could protest. "I'd expect nothing less for such an insult. Connington is a fine officer and commander, but even he overstepped greatly with his comments. I know no soldier in my company would let that pass, except Strickland," someone muttered from the back, and a few chuckles rippled through the group. Robert's focus, however, was sharp, locked on Blackheart, noting the question in the man's eyes, the quiet weight of what followed. "Sir?" he asked, his voice tentative. Blackheart's warning gaze lingered on his men for a moment longer before fading entirely, his attention now fixed entirely on Robert. "Very well," he said, his tone steely but deliberate, "let me be clearer." He paused, watching Robert intently, then spoke with measured conviction. "I want you to join my storied company." Even Toyn's soldiers seemed to pause at that, exchanging glances at Blackheart's words. "This is no pledge to restore you as king," Blackheart continued, his voice unwavering, "not like with the Blackfires, that era has passed. But this is a company of exiles, misfits, and castaways, men with no love for the Targaryens or their allies." He let the words hang in the air, each one with conviction. "I assure you, the Golden Company would be the only reasonable choice to accomplish such a task, should you decide it and possess the power to do so." Robert mulled the offer over in his head, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. What had he done since his defeat? He had broken the pledge he made to himself, to avoid drink and women until his return to Westeros. He had held to it for a fortnight after arriving in Myr, his first stop after Jon's ships brought him from the Vale. But then the familiar temptations of the city had pulled him back in. He'd failed in one negotiation after another, each meeting with a magister, archon, or triarch ending in disappointment. All had shown interest in him, in his plight, offering shelter and parading him before every person of importance in their cities, but none had offered anything more than fleeting promises. As word of Mud's growing popularity spread, their interest had cooled, seeing Robert as just another inconsequential pretender. They seemed to forget that his allies had once stood before the walls of King's Landing, that he had reduced House Targaryen to nothing but children and women. His supporters and men-at-arms began to drift away. What had started as a trickle soon became a flood, and he found himself from visiting brothels once every fortnight became weekly, until eventually, he never ended up staying in the same bed for more than a night. This, then, was the opportunity to do something. To take action, to fight again. He remembered countless conversations with Ned at the Eyrie, moaning about being the heir, wishing instead to be a sellsword in Essos. Now, that very opportunity lay before him. Yet there was one thing standing in his way. Robert's eyes flickered toward Connington, who still hung limp in the grip of his guards. "I will not fight beside that bastard," Robert spat, his voice low but filled with venom. "And if I accept, I expect it to be extended to my retinue as well." Blackheart's gaze shifted briefly to Connington, his expression darkening, before he shook his head. "That conversation can wait until the man recovers. As for your men," he continued, turning his focus back to Robert, "I would not think to deny them entry. I'm certain they are as competent as they are loyal." Robert stayed silent, his thoughts racing. Blackheart's resolve was unyielding, an ultimatum he couldn't ignore. The tension between them grew, thick and palpable, until Robert finally nodded. A quiet agreement, but one that felt like a decision for survival. He was sure he could handle the damn Griffin if things went south. "Release them," Blackheart commanded, his voice cold and final. Then, a smile cracked across his face, revealing incomplete rows of teeth. The soldiers released Robert, and he barely managed to steady himself on his feet. Before he could regain his balance, Blackheart appeared in front of him, extending a hand. Suspicion flared in Robert's mind, but he reluctantly accepted the gesture. Blackheart's hand darted past his, gripping his forearm instead, pulling him forward with surprising force. "A warrior's greeting, my friend," Blackheart said, his voice warm but laced with an edge. Robert's grip tightened as the Captain General leaned in, his words low and conspiratorial. You understand I was ribbing you at the start, correct? I'll treat you with the respect you deserve. Few others will offer you the same courtesy. Just try not to kill too many of my men, Baratheon. Robert met Blackheart's gaze evenly, his jaw tightening as he nodded. Very well, Captain General. Blackheart chuckled, shaking his head with an amused grin. No, no. Only the soldiers use titles. Officers? We stick to nicknames or surnames, it keeps things simple. Robert raised an eyebrow, curious toward his quick promotion. He hadn't thought titles accounted for much in sellsword companies. Blackheart gestured toward Connington's still unconscious form with a wry smirk. There's an opening, after all. Robert allowed a small grin to curl his lips, the first genuine one in what felt like ages. Perhaps this wouldn't be all too bad. Briefly, his mind wandered, indulging in the kind of fantasy that had fueled his pride for years. He pictured himself at the head of the Golden Company, their banners flying behind him as he marched through the gates of King's Landing. The Iron Throne loomed before him, its cruel beauty finally his. At its base, the heads of his enemies adorned the jagged swords. Christopher Mudd's impaled on one, Mace Tyrell's fat face skewered on another, and, finally, the head of this so-called King Aegon, a Targaryen who would learn like his father what it meant to challenge the Stormlord. Robert vowed, upon all the gods and as a Baratheon, that he would return to Westeros, no matter the cost. Christopher took a deep breath, his fingers brushing over the desk in front of him. He'd never spent time in the solar of River Run before, his visits here in the past had been brief, and only to escape his duties. But with Sarah's pregnancy nearing its end, he'd made the trip north from the capital. A few from the court had followed, some curious to see River Run without the Tullys, others eager to be the first to congratulate him on the birth of his first child. His first year as Hand of the King had shown him how hard it was to rid himself of sycophants and hangers-on. At most, he could manage a day without them before they found their way back. It had been 9 months since his wedding, a grand event with plenty of ceremony and celebration. He still remembered being surrounded by lords, envoys, and petitioners. Everyone seemed to want something, whether it was to make an impression, raise an issue they'd avoided bringing to Aerys or during the war, or just to test him. Still, for all the words exchanged and the so-called agreements made, very little had actually come of them. True change, he'd learned, happened later, in private, when empty promises and grand gestures were no longer enough. During his wedding feast, it had taken hours for him to relax, to dance with his wife, and to speak more freely. In hindsight, he recognized how necessary those moments had been. Everyone who mattered in Westeros and even across the narrow sea seemed eager to know him, to peel back the curtain on the mysterious Hand of the King who had risen from obscurity. None of them wanted unpredictability in their king or his hand. That kind of chaos had given rise to Aerys, the demands for change, and the ever-looming threat of rolling heads. The weight of expectations and endless formalities had dampened Christopher's genuine joy and excitement during the wedding feast, though the ceremony itself had been a different story. Still, he'd found his moments of merriment. Dancing with Sarah had been a highlight, wonderful and familiar, reminding him of their first dance at Harrenhal. It filled him with hope that their marriage could become more than just a politically advantageous match. The feast was filled with music, with bards and singers performing countless songs, but one stood out above the rest, the Mountain's Last Charge. The song immortalized his duel with Clegane, fought in defense of Elia and her children. It celebrated him as a heroic underdog, willing to risk everything for the loyalist cause. While the duel was widely known, even if only through rumors for some, it had often been overshadowed by the events that came before and after it. Yet after the bard's performance of the song, the room buzzed with renewed interest. Conversations shifted as rumors seemed to solidify into fact, and Christopher felt the change in the air. He noticed the way lords regarded him differently, their eyes flickering more than once to Torrent where it hung on his hip. The song had caught him off guard, but pleasantly so. It hadn't been a calculated move on his part. The bard had described it as a wedding gift from an anonymous source, saying he had only been given a recounting of the duel and tasked with crafting it into song. The mystery intrigued Christopher, though it didn't take him long to land on the likely source. When his gaze found Elia, her knowing smile all but confirmed his suspicion. Lord Hand. Christopher looked up from the desk to see Sir Barristan peeking through the door. A messenger from Maester Vyman, my lord. Christopher immediately rose to his feet. Send him in, Sir Barristan. The Kingsguard knight opened the door fully, admitting one of Maester Vyman's younger assistants. The boy stepped forward, bowing his head briefly before delivering the message. My lord, the Maester wishes you to know that your lady wife has entered labour. Show me the way, Christopher responded immediately, already moving around the desk with purpose. The young assistant's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic crossing his face. My lord, he stammered, the Maester instructed me explicitly, you are not to enter the chambers without his leave. It's for the babe's safety, my lord. Christopher stopped in his tracks, drawing a deep breath to steady himself. He made a conscious effort to keep his frustration in check. The boy was only delivering the Maester's instructions, after all. Being a lord didn't mean he had to mirror every flaw of those who had come before him. The messenger looked as though he might relieve himself in his small clothes at any moment. Very well, Christopher said, his voice carefully measured. But let me know of any changes in her condition, any changes, he emphasized, fixing the boy with a steady gaze. The boy nodded quickly, his head bobbing like a startled bird, before offering a hasty bow and fleeing the room. Christopher figured that if it was going to take some time, it would only make sense to use it productively. He turned on his heel and made his way back to the chair he had just vacated. With a sigh, he called toward the now closed door. Sir Barristan? After a brief moment, the older knight's head appeared once more. My lord? Could you have someone retrieve my work chest? Wherever it's been stored, please. Of course, my lord. I'll have a guard escorted as well to ensure there's no tampering. Wonderful. Christopher's tone was sincere. Sir Barristan was a gift from the gods. Though it had been a shame that the knight had turned cloak during the rebellion, Christopher understood the reasons and held no grudge. It had been one of his best decisions to heed Hightower's advice and reinstate Barristan. The two seasoned knights proved to be a much-needed counterbalance to their less experienced counterparts. Christopher had initially feared he had been too politically pragmatic with his choices, recognizing that while all were fine swordsmen, skill in battle alone didn't make a good Kingsguard. Fortunately, Gerald and Barristan proved him wrong, taking the younger knights under their wings without protest. Sir Desmond Mallister, only a few name days younger than Barristan, quickly adapted to the role, fitting into the Kingsguard as naturally as a fish to water. Sirs Valtries, Jamus, and Jeremy were a different matter. All eager, yes, but they ranged from just 1 and 20 to 5 and 20 name days. None of them possessed the extraordinary talent Sir Jaime Lannister had shown in his youth, nor did they match the legendary feats of a young Sir Barristan. It had taken longer than expected, but the new Kingsguard were finally beginning to fit in. They would never achieve the legendary status of the Bold, and in all likelihood, would be little more than footnotes in the White Book by the end of their service. Still, they would perform their duty, and that was all Christopher required. His thoughts shifted to the absent Kingsguard, Sir Arthur Dane. The renowned knight had been missing ever since his ship failed to arrive in King's Landing. The only thing that prevented Christopher from declaring the ship lost at sea was a report that had made its way to both Varys and Robin's growing network, citing a dark-haired knight with indigo eyes, carrying a black-haired babe, in the Lycian harbour a year ago. The details were scant, but it was enough to intrigue him. Such a pair was unlikely to be mistaken in any of the free cities. Still, whether or not Sir Arthur had survived, it left yet another vacancy in the Kingsguard. Gerald Hightower had argued that the Kingsguard served for life unless convicted of treason, and Sir Arthur, as far as anyone knew, was no traitor. He had been fulfilling his charge, protecting the youngest son of Prince Rhaegar. Christopher had given the Lord Commander a year for Sir Arthur to return before demanding a replacement. That deadline was fast approaching, and still, there was no sign of either Sir Arthur or Prince Jaehaerys. Christopher had noticed Gerald recently spending time in the courtyard, surveying the practicing knights. It was clear to him that the Lord Commander would see the King's Guard filled one way or another. Christopher rose from his seat once more, restlessly casting a glance at the door, as if daring the servant to appear at that very moment. When the expected arrival didn't come, he turned toward the balcony that accompanied the solar. He opened the doors and was met by a pleasant breeze, carrying the fresh scent of the river below, accompanied by the soothing sound of its flowing waters. 285 AC seemed to promise yet another long summer. No autumn was on the horizon, according to Grand Maester Gorman. Though Christopher was still warming to the Tyrell, he found himself inclined to believe the old man on this matter. The Lord's Solar was perched atop one of River Run's red-stoned towers, positioned at the southern corner of the three-sided castle, where the Tumblestone River met the Red Fork. From here, the rivers flowed around the castle, creating a natural defense. Gazing out, Christopher could see the meandering path of the Red Fork stretching far into the distance, small settlements and villages dotting its banks. To his left lay the relatively vast Whispering Wood. It wasn't as grand as the King's Wood or the Wolf's Wood, but it had provided timber to the Riverlands for millennia. He imagined much of the wood used to build the original old stones had been sourced from these very trees. River Run was a fine place, a suitable home that his wife had come to prefer over the constant bustle and stench of King's Landing. It was no surprise she had chosen to remain here for her pregnancy and the birth of their child. But despite its comfort, it was not his house's ancestral seat. That honor would, and could, only belong to old stones. Though now reduced to ruins, Christopher dreamed of its restoration, imagining it as a nearly impregnable fortress, where his descendants would rule the Riverlands for centuries to come. This would take time, of course, but Christopher hoped to begin the endeavor soon. It was the project he had devoted most of his time and effort to over the past year, maneuvering behind the scenes to make it a reality. The key to its success lay in strengthening both the Riverlands and his own position. Even rebuilding a castle was no small feat, costly, in fact, and Christopher had already had surveys done to identify where resources could be sourced. Now, the primary obstacle was the expense. To bolster the Riverlands, Christopher had employed a variety of strategies. He had secured new charters for both Fairmarket and Saltpans, breathing new life into their stagnating economies. According to Maester Vyman, those charters had been languishing for nearly half a century before Christopher's intervention. Additionally, he had leveraged old connections from his time as a gold cloak, trading favors with various guild leaders in King's Landing. He convinced them to establish subsidized branches in Maidenpool, Saltpans, and Fairmarket. The Smiths Guild, traders, Fletchers, and many others had all acquiesced after a few well-placed negotiations. The changes had been positive, though slow for now, with projections looking promising. However, new problems had emerged in the process, the most troublesome being in Maidenpool and Saltpans. While their rulers, Lord William Mouton and Sir Quincy Cox, had both reluctantly and eagerly supported his plans, the real issue arose with the burghers in both cities. These traders, far from welcoming the increased flow of goods, had become little more than opportunistic middlemen, taking advantage of the trade boom that Christopher's position as Hand of the King had created. They set outrageous fees for the use of their warehouses and transport, fully aware of the power they wielded in their cities. Unashamed, they responded to any negotiations with tales of high costs incurred during the aftermath of the rebellion, citing the need to finance reconstruction and other dubious claims. While the economic setback of the war and its aftermath was undeniable, Christopher found it curious when his men investigated other trading cities like Gulltown, Duskendale, and even King's Landing. There, trade activity had not only rebounded but, in some cases, had already surpassed pre-rebellion levels, and, more importantly, profits had skyrocketed. The merchants were, in the end, fleecing him. He was the one bearing the brunt of the costs, whether through scaring off otherwise eager trading partners or the reduced taxes from the cities, to name just a few examples. Fixing this situation was near the top of his priorities. More than once, in his more frustrated moments, Christopher had considered putting all the greedy bastards to the sword. But Maester Allard had come to him with a more interesting and realistic solution, one that was proving far more strategic. The key was to cut them out entirely, to eliminate their hold on the trade routes. The problem, as Allard had pointed out, was that these merchants only dared to exploit him because the ships and merchants arriving weren't directly affiliated with him. Some were Riverlanders, others hailed from the Vale, the north, and even Essos, but none were bound to Housemud. Maester Allard had suggested that Christopher acquire a fleet of his own, specifically, a merchant fleet, and build new warehouses and logistical networks to either threaten to or actually bypass the middlemen entirely, either letting them lose their livings or fall in line. It was no small task to acquire a fleet, and building one from scratch would be far too costly and time-consuming. But this was where being hand proved invaluable. Nothing had been finalized yet, but Christopher had a very interesting plan already in the works. "My lord, the chest as you requested." Christopher turned to see a servant clad in mud colors, bowing deeply as he gestured to a sturdy chest. "You have my thanks," Christopher replied, a small pleasure stirring within him. It pleased him to see servants in his house's colors serving his family. He imagined his grandfather would have been just as pleased. They had spoken of such things years ago during Christopher's childhood, dreams of power that had never imagined Riverrun as their seat. It had seemed so impossibly distant at the time. "These as well, my lord." The servant reached into his tunic and pulled out a number of missives. "The maester apologizes for the delay." "I would expect his focus to be on the berth," Christopher replied with a wave of his hand. "No worry. If you could place them on my desk for me." The servant bowed once more before leaving the room. After doing so, Christopher carefully opened the chest, nodding in satisfaction as he confirmed it was untouched since he had packed it in King's Landing, the near-invisible string across it still undisturbed. His gaze then shifted to the missives resting on his desk. After a moment's thought, he turned back to the chest, lifting it and placing it carefully on the desk as well before settling into his seat. Grabbing the first letter from the pile, Christopher saw it was from Lord Eddard Stark, wishing luck for Sarah's pregnancy and inquiring about his brother. Christopher set it aside, placing it in the personal urgent pile. He had a system for these, sorting them into personal and business, urgent and non-urgent. He spent the better part of the next hour sorting and skimming through the letters, pausing occasionally to jot down a reply. Most, however, were set aside to be addressed later, their urgency inconsequential with the maester already occupied regardless. Some were nothing more than mindless congratulations on the impending birth of his child, clearly sent by those eager to make an impression by being the first to extend well wishes. Others, however, were more substantive. There were reports of unrest in the Iron Islands. Since Lord Killion Greyjoy's death, his successor, Lord Balon, had remained silent and isolated on the islands. The only thing stopping Christopher from suspecting outright rebellion was the continued arrival of the yearly taxes on time. Still, it was a concern, though one that would have to wait for now. Elsewhere, there were some economic reports Christopher had personally requested, outside of the ones he received from Lord Mace during the small council meetings. While the Tyrell was far from inept with numbers, he had a tendency to downplay less favorable reports and emphasize the positive ones. This, of course, made Christopher double-check the figures. In truth, they weren't far off from each other, but the discrepancy added up. Christopher couldn't afford to be blind to potential issues, especially if troubling concerns began to surface. It wasn't all business, however. Over the past year, Christopher had built up some key relationships with certain lords across the realm who were of interest to his plans. The first was Lord Gerald Grafton of Gulltown, an ambitious man around Christopher's age, eager to rebuild after his father's loyal but ultimately disastrous decision to side with the crown against his liege lord. That choice hadn't only cost his father's head, it had cost the Graftons much of their standing. Lord Gerald, though, was determined to restore his house to prominence, and Christopher could see the potential in his ambition. Next was Sir Quincy Cox of Saltpans. The older knight was eager, almost to the point of impatience, for Christopher's plans to come to fruition. His enthusiasm had proven invaluable, especially when compared to the hesitancy of his counterpart, Lord Mouton. Sir Quincy was quickly solidifying his place as one of Christopher's most loyal vassals in the Riverlands, someone he could rely on when the need arose. Third was Lord Renfred Rugger of Duskendale. Since the defiance of Duskendale, the city had been shunned, and trade had suffered greatly. Under Christopher's leadership, however, Duskendale was beginning to regain its former strength, and Christopher had made sure to remind Lord Renfred of who to thank for it. Finally, and most substantially, was Lord Paxter Redwine of the Arbour. In this case, it was Christopher courting the Lord. The powerful Reachman seemed intrigued by the idea, and although they had agreed on nothing concrete yet, Christopher had already broached the topic of purchasing a fleet from the Redwine family. The Redwine fleet numbered in the hundreds, and the older lord had hinted that, for the right price, he could be convinced to part with some of them. Christopher was still considering just what he was willing to sacrifice to secure that fleet. Each of these lords, while important in their own right, also governed vital trade centers, differing in size, but all crucial for commerce in their respective regions. Christopher wouldn't go so far as to call them allies, but through letters and conversations, particularly during his wedding, they had all shown a certain warmth toward his position as Hand of the King. Each had expressed interest in mutual cooperation, offering glimpses of what they could achieve together. For his part, and given the considerable trade power they collectively held, Christopher envisioned the potential formation of a trade league, an alliance that could wield significant influence over the realm's politics long after his tenure as Hand. Naturally, he imagined himself at its head. Future members, should his ambitions take shape, might include Lord Manderley of White Harbour, a key figure in northern trade. The grand prize, however, would be securing Lord Hightower of Old Town, whose control of the ancient and sprawling port city would solidify the League's dominance, even if such an alliance seemed improbable at present. A final project he had set in motion was nearing fruition. Christopher had sponsored dozens of literate merchant sons, minor nobility, and other promising individuals to travel to the citadel, not with the intent of producing traditional maesters, but rather to foster a different kind of scholar. He sought the half-maesters, the learned men who did not bear the heavy chains of the maester's vows, nor the constraints of their rigid hierarchy. These were the scholars who could think beyond tradition, who could serve him and the Riverlands in ways the citadel's more orthodox scholars could not. They would study a range of subjects and return with the promise of fine livelihoods in exchange for their services. Christopher also promised generous rewards for any innovations, solutions, or discoveries that could help and enrich the Riverlands. One need only look to the free cities to see the potential for progress. It was clear to him that the Seven Kingdoms were stagnating, and Christopher refused to accept this as an inevitability. With a final exhale, Christopher allowed his thoughts to shift from ambitious dreams and future plans back to the present, where immediate responsibilities demanded his attention. He took a steadying breath and sifted through the stack of requests from his small councillors, the weight of governance pressing down on him once again. The first was a request from the Master of Coin for final approval to allocate funds toward refurbishing dilapidated houses in King's Landing. Thankfully, it required nothing more than his signature and seal. If the matter had reached his desk, then Lord Tyrell's subordinates would already have thoroughly vetted it. He reached into the chest, retrieving his two official seals, one bearing the crowned crest of House Mud, the other the sigil of the Hand, symbolizing his office. With practiced precision, Christopher poured a small pool of molten wax onto the document and, before it could cool, pressed each seal firmly into place. The impressions set crisply into the wax, their unmistakable marks affirming his authority and approval. It was almost laughably easy, considering the weight it carried. For him, it was a fleeting moment, an insignificant task amidst a mountain of others. Yet, for the tens, perhaps hundreds, of King's Landing's inhabitants, it meant roofs over their heads, warmer nights, and lives pulled just a little further away from misery. He set the sealed parchment aside with a quiet nod, acknowledging the unseen lives it would touch. It had been 3.5 tense hours before one of Maester Vyman's assistants entered Christopher's solar. Christopher was on his feet in an instant, dread coiling in his stomach as he turned to face the young man. "The Maester requests your presence, my lord," the assistant said, his voice calm but guarded. Christopher's eyes searched the man's face. "Bad news?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with concern. "Not necessarily," the assistant replied, offering little reassurance. Without another word, Christopher brushed past him into the corridor. Sir Barristan silently fell into step behind, moving with the ease of a shadow. When they reached the birthing chambers, Christopher was surprised to find two familiar figures waiting outside. His wards, Benjen and Edmure, stood together, their faces a mix of curiosity and nervous energy. "Benjen? Edmure?" Christopher said, his voice light despite the tension in his chest. "What are you doing here and not in the training yard?" Benjen, now 5 and 10, shrugged. Edmure, 2 years younger, flushed slightly, the tips of his ears reddening. The two had grown close despite their age difference. What had started with Edmure trailing after the Stark boy, begging to train with him, had blossomed into a steadfast bond. These days, they were inseparable, often seen sparring in the courtyard from dawn till dusk. "We wanted to see the babe, my lord," Benjen explained, standing straight. Christopher had tried to convince the Stark boy to forego the formalities in private, but Benjen was resolute. Beside him, Edmure nodded quickly. "Aye," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Christopher inclined his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Very well. I suppose you two might just earn the honor of being the first to meet the newest member of the family." "Boy or girl?" Edmure blurted out, then immediately shrank back under Christopher's gaze. Sorry," he stammered. Christopher sighed gently, the boy's shyness not unexpected. It had taken time for Edmure to warm to him, given the circumstances of his wardship. Sarah, Christopher's wife, was Edmure's cousin on his mother's side, which had helped ease the transition, but the boy's trust was still tentative. "What do I hope for?" Christopher asked, letting the question linger. Edmure nodded hesitantly. "My wife insists it's a boy," Christopher said, a wry smile touching his lips. "She's been saying so since the moment she learned of the pregnancy, claims she can feel it." His smile faded slightly. "But truly, I'll be grateful for either, a boy or a girl, so long as they're healthy." Edmure seemed to relax a little at the response, his posture easing, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the chamber door as if expecting something to come bursting through. Christopher turned to Sir Barristan. "I suppose there's no time like the present." The older knight allowed himself a small, measured smile. "I can't claim much experience with the birth of a child of my own, my lord, but I was present for most of Queen Ryella's labors. It's not something a father should miss if he can help it." His tone carried a quiet wisdom, though the smile faltered, shadowed by memories. The tragedy of Queen Ryella's many pregnancies and the sorrow they brought had clearly left its mark on the knight, as it had on all who served her. Touched by the weight in Sir Barristan's words, Christopher placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of quiet understanding. The knight inclined his head in gratitude. The muffled sounds of labor reached Christopher's ears, faint through the heavy door. He withdrew his hand, feeling his pulse quicken. Steeling himself, he stepped toward the door. The cries grew sharper as he neared, and the tension coiled tighter in his chest. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, attendants rushed to and fro, their movements swift and purposeful, the air thick with urgency. The scent of sweat, herbs, and faint traces of blood mingled, sharp and almost metallic. A brazier glowed in the corner, filling the room with a dim, flickering warmth that danced across the walls. Maester Vyman stood by the bedside, his face calm but focused as he murmured instructions to the midwives. Sarah lay propped up on a mountain of pillows, her hair plastered to her forehead in damp strands, her skin pale but determined. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the bedframe, the strain of each contraction etched into her face. Christopher hesitated in the doorway, his breath catching as he took in the scene. The reality of it struck him anew. This was not a distant concern to be solved or a battle to be fought. This was his wife, his child. Sarah's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his boots crossing the threshold. Her gaze found him, and despite the obvious pain, her lips curved into a faint smile. "Christopher," Sarah gasped, her voice breaking halfway through a moan of pain, but beneath it was a note of unmistakable relief, like a woman sighting shore after a storm. He was at her side in an instant, his hand slipping into hers, steady and firm despite the tremor he felt in his own heart. Her grip tightened, as if anchoring herself to him amid the chaos. "I'm here," he replied, his voice low but steady. "Stay strong, Sarah. Soon, we'll hold our child in our arms." Another contraction racked her body, and Sarah arched against the pillows, a sharp cry escaping her lips. Her free hand gripped the sheets with knuckles white from the strain. Christopher's heart twisted at the sight, helpless to do more than stay by her side. He leaned in closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. "You're doing so well," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, the words feeling achingly inadequate. His heart twisted painfully in his chest, seized by the sheer helplessness of watching her endure such agony while he could do nothing to ease it. How strange, he thought, that this felt harder than battle. In war, there was danger, fear, but also the comfort of action, the distraction of agency. Here, he was left with nothing but the rawness of his own powerlessness, each of her cries carving deeper into his soul. A throat cleared behind him, drawing his attention. "My lord," came the measured voice of Maester Wyman. Christopher turned, his expression sharpening as he took in the older man's purposeful demeanor. The Maester gestured toward a quieter corner of the chamber, his expression calm but urgent. "A word, if you please." Christopher hesitated, his hand still clasping Sarah's. She felt his pause and gave a faint nod, her teeth gritted against the next wave of pain. "Oh," she managed between labored breaths. "I'll be fine." Reluctantly, Christopher released her hand, pressing a kiss to her damp brow before following Maester Wyman to the edge of the room. There, away from the flurry of midwives and attendants, the Maester turned to him, his tone low but firm. "My lord, I wish to inform you that the birth is progressing quite rapidly," Wyman began, his measured tone doing little to mask the gravity of his words. His steady gaze held Christopher's, though the Maester seemed to weigh each word with care. Christopher's brows knit together, unease stirring in his chest. "And this means?" he asked, letting the question hang heavy in the air. Wyman hesitated for a heartbeat, then continued, his voice calm but deliberate. "It is difficult to say with certainty. A swift labor can be unremarkable, or it can carry risks. I will say we've moved past the most concerning early stages. That said, the babe is nearing crowning, which, while promising, can sometimes bring its own complications." Christopher leaned forward, his voice sharp with urgency. "What kind of complications?" "Typically, a rapid labor occurs in women who've given birth before or in younger mothers. If I may be so bold, your lady wife may well belong to the latter category, if we are fortunate. However, such speed can also put strain on her body, especially her internal tissues. It's usually something we would notice immediately, and thus far, there's been no sign of such damage. Still, I wanted to make you aware of the potential risks." Christopher fell silent, processing the Maester's words. He pursed his lips for a moment, then nodded resolutely. "I appreciate your candor, Maester. Is there anything else I should know?" Maester Wyman's response was calm. "You may return to your wife, my lord." He didn't hesitate. Striding back, he took his place by Sarah's side once more, his hand finding hers with reassuring firmness. She met his gaze, her eyes clouded with exhaustion and question, but he offered her only a soft, comforting smile. "There's nothing to worry about," he murmured, his voice steady despite the storm within him. "Just focus on staying strong. We're almost there." Sarah's eyes flickered with uncertainty, her lips parting as if to ask another question, but the words were lost as another contraction gripped her. She squeezed Christopher's hand with a force that took him by surprise, a reminder of the strength she was summoning in the face of her pain. For what felt like an eternity, this was his world, his pulse racing in his ears as he watched her struggle, unable to do anything but offer his presence and steady hand. The helplessness gnawed at him. The only thing keeping him from despair was Maester Vyman's reassurances that the labor was nearing its end. Then, without warning, a midwife's shout broke through the tension, sharp and urgent. The babe's crowning now. Christopher's breath caught in his throat, a mixture of horror and relief flooding his chest. Maester Vyman appeared at the bedside in an instant, confirming the news with a brief glance before turning to Sarah. "Not much longer now, my lady," he said, his voice firm and steady. "Keep pushing." He quickly took command of the room again, barking orders to the midwives with a precision Christopher couldn't follow in his dazed state. All he could do was watch, his hand never leaving Sarah's, as the moment they had both been waiting for drew ever closer. Christopher felt as though he were imprisoned within his own body, powerless to do anything but watch and endure. Sarah's screams echoed through the chambers, a relentless, unending sound that seemed to grow in intensity as the contractions came faster and harder. Every cry made his heart twist with helplessness. Then, at last, a sharp, shrill scream pierced the air, a sound so raw and primal that it shook him to his core. His breath caught, his entire body rigid, as his gaze snapped downward to where the midwife emerged from between Sarah's trembling legs, holding a tiny, wriggling form in her arms. The babe, slick with fluids, was a shock to his senses, but Christopher's eyes were locked on the child, unable to look away even as the midwife moved swiftly to clean and swaddle the baby in a soft blanket. The elderly midwife's hands moved with the practiced speed and precision of someone who had seen hundreds of births, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions coursing through Christopher. Sarah, in her exhaustion, seemed almost delirious, her eyes glazed and distant as she muttered incoherently about her baby. Christopher's heart ached at the sight, and he leaned down, his hand gentle as it stroked her cheek. The touch seemed to ground her, if only for a moment, and her eyes fluttered open, meeting his with a faint glimmer of recognition. She whispered his name weakly, as though drawing strength from his presence. "It's over, you were wonderful," Christopher murmured, his voice thick with emotion as he gently brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's damp forehead. "We have our child, Sarah." Her head, heavy with exhaustion, lifted slowly from the pillows as she searched his face, her eyes wide with an almost desperate need. "Where?" she asked, her voice trembling on the verge of tears, the pain still lingering in her features. Christopher's heart clenched at the sight, and he leaned closer, guiding her gaze gently toward the swaddled babe that rested in the arms of the midwife. "Breathe, my wife," he whispered softly, his thumb tracing circles along her knuckles, urging her to steady herself. The midwife, careful and reverent in her movements, approached, her voice calm as she spoke the words that Christopher had been aching to hear. "A boy, my lord and lady," she announced, her hand steady as she lowered the newborn to Sarah's waiting breast. Sarah's breath caught, and Christopher saw the faint glimmer of a smile flicker across her face as their son was placed into her arms, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the presence of the tiny life they had created. They both gazed down at the tiny creature in awe, the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest a quiet miracle between them. For a moment, the world outside the chamber faded, and there was only this new life, fragile, beautiful, and perfect. The peaceful silence was broken by Maester Vyman's voice, unexpectedly calm amidst the flurry of emotions. "What will you name the boy?" Sarah looked up at him, her eyes shining with a quiet joy, and her fingers gently stroked the babe's downy head. She met Christopher's gaze, and for a brief moment, there was a wordless exchange between them. "I was thinking, Tristan, after your grandsire," she said softly, her voice thick with affection. Christopher, moved by her choice, smiled warmly at the maester. "A wonderful suggestion," he agreed, his voice tinged with pride. "Tristan it is." Maester Vyman gave a small, approving nod, his gaze lingering briefly on the newborn. "Now, the boy needs nourishment," he said gently, his tone firm yet compassionate as he turned to Sarah with a quiet, imploring look. Sarah, still flushed from the effort, met his gaze with steady resolve. She nodded, her eyes soft but determined. "I will do it." Christopher rose slowly, giving Sarah's hand one last reassuring squeeze before stepping back. He glanced at the two of them, his heart full with a mixture of awe and relief, and then quietly withdrew from the bedside to grant them a measure of privacy. Maester Vyman moved to Christopher's side, his expression grave yet reassuring. "A healthy boy and mother, my lord. We will keep them under observation, of course, but the gods have been merciful." Christopher's smile was genuine, a rare warmth in his gaze. "Your actions today will not be forgotten, Maester. Neither my wife nor I will allow it." The Maester shook his head, a modest flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "My lord, I only did my duty. You've given me an heir, and to the Riverlands, that is no small service," Christopher countered firmly. "You have my deepest gratitude." For a moment, Maester Vyman stood in silence, the weight of the Lord's words sinking in. With a quiet, respectful bow, he replied, "As you say, my lord." "Let me not keep you from your rest," Christopher insisted, his voice softer now. "Take the day off, Maester." The Maester nodded silently, though the slight furrow of his brow suggested he wasn't entirely convinced he'd heed the advice. Still, he gave no argument, merely offering a quiet bow before stepping back. Christopher turned his attention back to Sarah and their son, the tiny babe nursing contentedly from her breast as a midwife hovered nearby, watching over them with quiet care. Sarah gazed down at their child with a look of pure adoration, her eyes soft and filled with love. Christopher couldn't help but marvel at how small the baby was. He hadn't known children could be so delicate. His thoughts wandered to his first son, Tristan, who he'd not seen before he was 3. The stark contrast between the two boys, one a true-born heir, the other a bastard, struck him unexpectedly. He imagined Tristan, likely playing with Aegon and Rhaenys at the Red Keep, under Elia's watchful eye. He hoped his son didn't miss him too much. Christopher knew how much Tristan valued every visit he could manage between his duties. He made a point to sit with the children for meals at least twice a week, savoring those moments. But he also knew that, for Tristan, longer absences had sprung up from time to time. Christopher only hoped he could bring his bastard son along, when he got a little older, at least to Riverrun. At first, Tristan had been deeply upset by the separation, the absence of his mother leaving a void in his young heart. Elia had done her best to fill that gap, but it wasn't the same. Christopher felt the sting of guilt every day for taking his son away from her. He knew that Tristan, despite being a child of his own blood, would always feel the absence of his mother more keenly than anyone else. But there simply was no way around it. There was no world where Christopher could afford to bring Elenay along, even if she had wanted to. She was no woman to be kept hidden as a paramour, no matter how much Sarah had accepted the arrangement. Christopher had made a choice, the best choice, in his eyes, though it pained him to see the effects it had on Tristan. He would make it up to his son, he swore that. It was a pledge Christopher made to himself in quiet moments like these, and one he intended to keep, no matter the cost. Christopher sighed, pushing those thoughts aside. Now was not the time for such heavy reflections. His family had grown once again. Sarah was happy, their son was healthy. For now, he needed to embrace the joy of this moment, to hold on to the warmth that surrounded him, at least for a little while. Duty and past regrets could wait. Old stones. Arthur's new home still felt foreign to him, even after a year. The sun blazed as fiercely as it did in dawn, but here, the sea wind swept across the island, carrying a strange coolness that cut through the heat. Leaning against the lemon tree, Arthur kept a watchful eye on the toddling prince. The child was Rhaegar's, undoubtedly, but there was no mistaking it. The boy was Lyanna's too. It was in the way he moved, small and sure-footed, a little wolf already. Jaehaerys was chasing a small lizard through the grass, his giggles ringing out as he nearly caught it, only for the creature to slip from the toddler's grasp once more. Arthur allowed himself a small smile before his gaze lifted from the boy. Though the garden's high walls offered safety, he remained alert. The Magister's guards stood watch at the entrances, their spears glinting in the sunlight. He knew all too well that any attempt at escape would be complicated if they turned hostile. But if Perino Maracos had intended harm, then Arthur concluded that he would have done so already. Perino had been recommended by Arthur's brother as a reliable ally, a rare quality among the Magisters of Lys. Arthur had agreed, though reluctantly. Perino was no honorable man in the traditional sense, but he kept his own code, and his word, once given, seemed genuine enough. The Magister had opened his home to Arthur and Jaehaerys without hesitation, treating them more like honored guests than fugitives. Arthur suspected Perino saw their presence as a mark of prestige, a chance to host a Westerosi prince and the Sword of the Morning under his roof. Perino had risen to Gonfalonier just over a year ago, a unique title in Lys, head of the city's military. Arthur had been more confused than impressed when Perino explained that it was an elected position, one that in times of peace was used largely for political maneuvering, with little regard for actual competence or military skill. The Magister had called it a stepping stone, his sights set on becoming the city's first Magister in the next election. Arthur would have cared little about such ambitions if Perino weren't his host. Still, the Magister's protection was a shield, however thin, and Arthur couldn't afford to discard it. Not with Jaehaerys' safety at stake. His gaze shifted to the maid keeping watch over the prince. Lizara, her name was. A pretty thing, in the Lysine way, with silver hair, milk-pale skin, and eyes the color of a summer sky. But Arthur knew better than to trust beauty in a city like Lys. Her loyalty could be bought for the right wage, one that for now came from the Magister's purse. Still, Lys seemed to be the best place to stay for now. Mud did not look to be one to be toppled anytime soon. His position as Hand only more secure now according to rumors and letters that his brother routinely sent. Even in Lys and the other free cities, conversations during dinner were filled with stories of the thought-extinct royal house and its new head and his exploits. Sir, right? Lizara spoke hesitantly, her voice faltering. Arthur inclined his head, turning his gaze toward her. Is that truly Dawn at your side? The young woman pointed to his family's greatest pride. He picked up the blade from where it had been resting beside him, drawing it from its sheath to reveal the strange, pale metal in all its glory. It is indeed, he replied, his curiosity piqued. I'm surprised you know of it. She reddened, clearly flustered. My little brother is fascinated by Westerosi knights. When he starts talking about them, he never stops. Lizara gave a rueful shake of her head. He says the Sword of the Morning, the Wielder of Dawn, is the greatest knight in all of Westeros. Arthur smiled wryly. I always tried to be the best knight I could be. Whether I was the greatest is not for me to say. Humility is part of the chivalric code, is it not? Lizara replied, her tone thoughtful. He grinned slightly. It sounds as though you're more educated on the subject than you let on. Lizara flushed, but there was a glint of intelligence in her blue eyes, a spark that told him she was no simple maid. Maybe my brother's incessant babbling sparked an interest. Before Arthur could respond, a sudden scream pierced the air, coming from the manse. In an instant, he was on his feet, Dawn fully bared in his hand, his body reacting before Lizara could even comprehend what was happening. She stumbled back at the sudden motion, and the light tone that had surrounded them vanished in an instant. Arthur didn't spare another thought for the girl, his attention fixed on Jaehaerys, who was gazing curiously toward the manse. Arthur's gaze shifted to the entrances. The guards were gone. Take the boy to the harbor, he said, his voice sharp and commanding. There's a warehouse with a red door and the sigil of House Dane carved into it. My brother's men are there and can protect you both. The prince's safety is paramount. Is that understood? Lizara shakily nodded, but Arthur didn't like the hesitance in her eyes. He stepped closer, looming over her smaller form. Her eyes flickered with fear. Use the main roads, he instructed, his voice low and firm. Don't let yourself be caught in an alley or side street. Protect the boy as if he were your own, and I will ensure a generous reward for your service. I need your promise. Lizara swallowed hard, her gaze locked with his. For a long moment, they stood like that. Finally, she nodded, a bit more resolutely.
I promise to get the prince to safety.
Hurry then, Arthur urged, his voice urgent. I'll escort you out of the manse. Lizara quickly darted over to the toddler, lifting him with a startled yip before hurrying toward the garden's exit. Arthur broke into a jog, instinctively taking the lead. Though his plate armor was stored safely in his quarters, he was still armed with Dawn, and he knew it would take a formidable force to challenge his abilities. They moved swiftly and cautiously toward the main entrance of the manse. It was the quickest route, and Arthur had no time for alternatives. They ducked into the shadows whenever anyone passed by, regardless of who it was. As they moved, Arthur's mind raced. It was becoming clear, a force had attacked the manse, though the attackers' goals, their numbers, and their competence were still unknown. He could hear the sounds of fighting between Perino's men and the assailants, clashes of steel and shouted orders. Eventually, they reached the entrance. Arthur gestured for Lizara to stay low as he guided her behind a thick bush near the gate, the sounds of battle still echoing faintly around them. Arthur crouched, breath steady, eyes scanning the entrance. 5 men. Not Perinos. Their armor was mismatched, their postures loose with the careless confidence of sellswords. His grip tightened around Dawn's hilt as he slipped along the garden wall, silent as a shadow. Why are we stuck out? A younger sellsword began, only to be cut off. Want me to take your tongue, Denyo? Growled a hulking brute. The one called Denyo scoffed. Come on, surely you're not happy standing here like a fucking statue while the rest are looting? Captain's orders, snapped a third man, older, leaning against a pillar. No one leaves the manse. Now shut your trap before I shut it for you. Arthur was already forming a plan in his mind. 5 armed sellswords were no easy fight, and an open confrontation would draw far too much attention. But if he could separate them. He slipped back to where Lizara hid in the bushes, her hand pressing firmly over Jaehaerys' mouth. Sir, he refuses to be quiet, the maid whispered, fear wide in her eyes. Arthur glanced down at the boy. The prince's stormy grey eyes burned with determination, his small body still tense from struggling in Lizara's arms. He had only just stopped fighting her, likely the moment Arthur arrived. Take your hand off his mouth for a moment, Arthur ordered. Lizara looked at him as if he'd gone mad, but at his steady gaze, she hesitated, then complied. The instant her hand left, Jaehaerys let out a shrill cry. Arthur barely reacted, only nodding to Lizara. She quickly clamped her hand over the prince's mouth again. Keep him quiet until you're outside the manse, Arthur instructed. Then hide him under your dress until you reach the warehouse. Lizara's face remained taut with terror and confusion, but after a moment, she nodded. Arthur turned away, refocusing on the entrance. He bent down, drawing a dagger from his boot, gripping it in his offhand while his other rested lightly on Dawn's hilt. Then, he waited. Voices drifted closer. Thank Pantera, one man muttered. Think it's the boy we're looking for. Maracos doesn't have any children, right? Arthur recognized the voice, Denyo, the lean, arrogant sellsword who had been complaining. In his hand he twirled a falchion lazily even as he looked around the surroundings. A deeper voice answered, clipped and certain. It's the boy. Now silence. Arthur's eyes flicked toward the second man. Bigger. Hefting a Norvosi longaxe like the new Martell captain of guards. A greater threat. Arthur exhaled once, steadying himself. Then he struck. Bursting from the undergrowth, he moved like a shadow, Dawn already in motion, its pale blade a streak of light, cutting straight for the Norvosi sellsword. The sellsword was fast, surprisingly so for his size, but he hadn't expected a trained warrior. He barely missed the block, and it was his last mistake. Arthur's blade sliced clean through the man's thick neck, meeting no resistance. The body crumpled, blood spilling dark over the ground. Denyo cursed, stumbling back into a bush, his falchion slipping mid-twirl from his grip. Arthur turned toward him, his shadow looming over the sellsword. Denyo scrambled for his weapon, rolling as he reached for the hilt. But Arthur was faster. With the precision of countless hours of training, he slammed his dagger into Denyo's reaching arm, pinning it just as his fingers brushed the falchion's grip. Denyo choked on a scream, but Arthur was already on him, a hand clamping hard over his mouth, silencing him before he could alert the others. "How many of you are there, and who hired you?" Arthur demanded, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Anything else, and you won't be with us much longer." The sellsword's eyes brimmed with tears, fury warring with fear in his gaze. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. Slowly, Arthur raised his free hand. A scream tore from the sellsword's throat, but it was cut short as Arthur slammed his hand over the man's mouth. "Wrong choice," he murmured, reaching for the dagger embedded in Denyo's arm. With a slow, deliberate twist, he drove fresh agony through the wound. The sellsword thrashed beneath him, but it was useless. Arthur held firm. Then, a voice called from the entrance, making him still for a moment. "Quit torturing the boy. They want this prince alive." It was the older sellsword. They had mistaken Denyo's scream for Jaehaerys. Denyo realized it, too. Their eyes met, understanding passing between them. Arthur leaned in slightly, his grip unrelenting. His voice was calm, almost patient, like a maester addressing a particularly slow student. "I take no pleasure in this," he said. "Now, how many of you are there, and who is your employer?" Denyo hesitated, Arthur's hand raised halfway. Then, with a pained look, he finally complied. "Around 4 and 10, he rasped. "The rest are inside, tasked with capturing the boy and killing the Magister. As for our employer, only the captain knows." Arthur absorbed the information, filing it away. "And where is he?" Denyo swallowed hard. "Probably about to kill the Magister," he admitted through gritted teeth. "Now will you?" Before he could finish, Arthur's hand clamped over his mouth once more. Denyo's eyes widened, first in confusion, then in sheer terror and betrayal. He tried to plead, but Arthur didn't move. "I am a knight no longer," Arthur murmured. "My duty is to Prince Jaehaerys and him alone. And I cannot risk you putting him in danger." With a swift motion, he wrenched the dagger free from Denyo's arm, drawing a choked gasp of pain. The sellsword struggled, but it was futile. One clean stroke across the throat, and it was over. Arthur had to move quickly. His first priority was the prince's safety, but once Jaehaerys and Lizara were secure, he would need to protect the Magister as well. If the man died, they would have no choice but to flee the city, something Arthur was not eager to do. His gaze shifted to the entrance, where 3 shadows still stood guard. He looked down at the fallen sellsword, then wiped his dagger clean in the grass before sliding it back into the hidden sheath in his boot. Finally, he took Dawn in both hands. To respect every engagement, every opponent, was one of the first lessons he had learned from Barristan. He would not do so now either. Arthur began his approach, moving as silently as possible. But then, a sharp crack. A stick snapped beneath his foot. The older sellsword, the one who had scolded Denyo earlier, turned in his direction. Though Arthur remained behind a bush, it was clear the cover was not enough. "Denyo? Doro? Where's the bee?" One of the others cut him off. "That's not them." Arthur didn't hesitate. He surged forward. The older sellsword barely managed to block the strike, stumbling backward in an effort to regain distance. The second man, the one who had spotted him, let out a war cry and charged. Arthur moved fluidly, sweeping Dawn from the first blocked strike straight into the second man's plain shortsword. The impact sent a shudder through the sellsword's grip, his guard shattered, his hold barely intact. Arthur exploited this instantly. With a deft twist of his blade, he redirected the momentum, driving Dawn clean into the man's advancing form. The sellsword gasped, a strangled cry escaping his lips as Arthur spun aside, letting the man's body collapse past him, his sword clattering uselessly against the cobblestone path. One down. Arthur didn't slow. The last sellsword stood silent, his watchful gaze marking him as the most dangerous of the three. A Tyroshi, judging by his oddly colored beard and hair. Unlike the others, he didn't charge recklessly, he was studying Arthur, calculating. Arthur had no time for a prolonged duel. He struck first, a probing attack meant to test his opponent. The Tyroshi reacted instantly, parrying with firm precision. Then, with startling speed, he countered, his blade whipping around Dawn, aiming to sever Arthur's grip from his weapon. But Arthur was faster. With a practiced motion, he angled Dawn's crossguard into the attack's path, deflecting the long sword just enough to send it glancing harmlessly to the side. A narrow escape, but Arthur had no time to capitalize on it. Instinct screamed a warning. The older sellsword was rejoining the fight. Arthur caught a glimpse of the man's weapon, a fine, castle-forged blade. He doubted it had been acquired honestly. He even thought he saw the faint etching of a noble house's sigil, though he couldn't place which. The veteran sellsword aimed a killing thrust at Arthur's exposed side, hoping to catch him distracted. Arthur barely evaded, rolling away just in time. In that moment, he was grateful he wasn't weighed down by armor, it would have slowed him enough to end the fight right then. The older sellsword's overcommitted thrust sent him slightly off balance. Arthur seized the opening. From the ground, he swept Dawn upward in a brutal arc. The blade met flesh, cleaving through both of the man's hands. Bone barely put up a fight before giving way. A scream tore through the air as the older sellsword collapsed, clutching his bleeding stumps to his chest. Arthur had no time to spare him a second glance. The Tyroshi paid no heed to his fallen comrade. He saw only an opening. With a fierce overhead strike, he brought his long sword down toward Arthur's prone form. The impact nearly overpowered Arthur's desperate block, both blades slamming into the cobblestones beside him. He felt the wind of the steel brushing past his face, too close. Instinct took over. Abandoning Dawn for a moment, Arthur drove his fist into the Tyroshi's face. Pain exploded through his knuckles, but the strike did its job. The sellsword staggered, his grip loosening just enough. Arthur surged to his feet, reclaiming Dawn and the fallen longsword. The fight was over. Fuck. The elder sellsword's agonized cry came from the ground beside them, but neither Arthur nor the Tyroshi spared him a glance. The sellsword met Arthur's gaze, his breath steady despite his defeat. "You are a true warrior," he said, nodding toward Dawn. "And you honor the sword you wield." Arthur inclined his head slightly. "A fine duel," he acknowledged. Then, his tone turned final. "But your life is now forfeit. Make peace with whatever gods you hold." The Tyroshi closed his eyes and nodded. Arthur waited a moment, then drove Dawn into his heart, ending him instantly. The Tyroshi collapsed without a sound as Arthur slid Dawn free. He turned to the older sellsword, still writhing on the ground, moaning in agony over his ruined arms. Arthur ended his suffering with a swift, unceremonious stroke. Then, he called for Lizara. She emerged hesitantly from the bushes, her arms wrapped tightly around Jaehaerys. Her wide eyes darted across the scene, the lifeless bodies strewn across what had once been a pristine courtyard. Then, her gaze settled on Arthur. His tunic and face were smeared with blood. Mostly Denyo's, from when he had slit the man's throat, the spray covered him. Lizara swallowed hard but said nothing. "Run. Now," Arthur commanded. Lizara didn't hesitate. She tucked the prince beneath her dress, disguising his identity as best she could, then took off at a sprint. Arthur watched until they disappeared around a bend in the road. Only then did he turn back toward the manse, where the sounds of battle still rang out. He moved swiftly, heading for the Magister's Solar. Perino would most likely be there. The journey took mere minutes, though it felt longer. Twice, he had to duck into the shadows as roaming sellswords passed dangerously close. Each time, he remained unseen. At last, he reached the Solar. The door had been smashed open. Inside, 8 sellswords surrounded Perino and his 2 most elite guards. Unsullied. Arthur had heard much of them, eunuchs, trained from birth to be perfect soldiers, stripped of fear, of pain, of emotion. Their discipline was absolute. But now was not the time for hesitation. Arthur tightened his grip on Dawn and stepped forward. Perino's gaze snapped toward Arthur, frantic, yet determined. The movement did not go unnoticed. The central sellsword followed the Magister's eyes, along with 2 of his men. The moment he saw Arthur, recognition flared in his expression. Well, he drawled, a smirk tugging at his lips. Look what we have here, the wayward Kingsguard. His tone was mocking, but there was an edge of amusement. Then again, a Kingsguard is never truly wayward when they're guarding a royal, are they? His eyes gleamed. I take it you've hidden the boy away. Arthur said nothing. The sellsword only shrugged. A shame. But no matter, I'm sure I'll make his acquaintance soon enough, once you and these 3 are. He stopped himself, smile widening as if something amusing had just occurred to him. Ah, he chuckled. Where are my manners? With a flourishing bow, the man spoke grandly, his tone dripping with mock courtesy. Quos, captain of the Jolly Fellows. The name rang a distant bell in Arthur's mind, though he couldn't quite place it. Quos, however, caught the flicker of recognition in his expression. His smile widened. Ah, your esteemed colleague, the bold, might know us better. His eyes gleamed with amusement. We had the honor of taking part in the humble conquest of the Stepstones. Well, our predecessors did. Most of those poor bastards died, of course. But we survived, reformed, and now, fate has placed a new Kingsguard knight in our path. His grin sharpened. How curious, is it not? Quos mused, his tone light, almost playful. Arthur's patience had run thin. Are you finished? He asked flatly. The grin vanished from Quos' face, replaced by an ugly grimace. You Westerosi knights, he spat. Devoid of any life. Arthur shook his head in exasperation, his grip tightening on Dawn as he raised the blade, pointing its pale edge directly at the captain. Say your prayers, captain. Quos didn't react to his words as ignores them in favor of the blade. This will make a fine conquest indeed, Quos said, a twisted smile playing on his lips. Arthur's expression remained cold, but internally, he was preparing himself. This was no inexperienced warrior. Quos was clearly ready, believing for some reason that victory was within his reach. Are you always this delusional? Arthur asked, his voice steady. Delusional? The captain echoed with a grin, unbothered. No, rather, ambitious. They always call themselves ambitious before they stumble at the first step, Arthur replied, his tone laced with disdain. So tell me, Captain, are there any real abilities behind those words, or are you just a barking dog? The smile on Quos' face faltered, his eyes narrowing with rising anger. Enough pleasantries, he snapped, his expression hardening as he raised his sword. The tension snapped in an instant. Arthur saw the Unsullied move in perfect unison, and in that same moment, he surged forward. He had always preferred the offense. When facing multiple opponents, it was the best way to disrupt their coordination, to keep them off balance and prevent them from working together. He feigned an attack toward Quos, drawing the captain's attention, then swiftly redirected his focus to the sellsword on the right. The man had misjudged Arthur's initial movement, lowering his guard to prepare for a counterattack. Arthur struck with lethal precision, Dawn cutting cleanly through the man's leather jerkin. Blood spurted as the blade sank deep, and with a gurgling cry, the man collapsed to the marble floor, his lifeblood staining the once pristine stone. Arthur didn't pause to look. He immediately shifted to face Quos, eyes locked on the captain and the remaining guard, both now focused entirely on him. On the opposite side of the room, the Unsullied and Perino were holding the other sellswords at bay, keeping them distracted and disorganized. Quos' face twisted into an expression of disbelief. Who was this fool? The remaining guard, his face red with rage, charged at Arthur, the distance between them closing rapidly. He seemed to be closer to the fallen man than anyone else, perhaps brothers. They did share a certain resemblance, both in stature and in their proficiency. With almost embarrassing ease, Arthur swept aside the guard's blade. But this time, he couldn't capitalize on the opening. The guard's sheer momentum carried him forward, slamming into Arthur and knocking him off balance. A flash of frustration surged through Arthur. Damn it, focus. He gritted his teeth, quickly recovering as the guard's weight came crashing down atop him. Thinking fast, Arthur used the guard's momentum against him, twisting and dragging him over his head with a fluid, practiced motion. The guard, now momentarily off balance, was denied the chance to pin him down. Quoss wasted no time. With a now greedy gaze, any confusion or fear gone. He was already on the offensive, his blade a blur. Arthur dodged the first swipe, the air parting with the force of it, and then the second, each movement fluid and instinctual. His eyes stayed locked on Quoss, constantly scanning for any advantage, any weapon within reach. Then, he saw it, the fire stoker by the hearth, just a few feet away. When Quoss aimed a deadly swipe at his head, Arthur pivoted, narrowly avoiding the strike. The room felt like it slowed as he dashed for the stoker, seizing it just as Quoss pressed forward, intent on ending him. The stoker had heft to it, its cold iron solid in his grip, but Arthur didn't fool himself. He doubted it would hold up for long, but for now, it was enough. The fire stoker proved its worth, solid and reliable in Arthur's grip. He parried Quoss' next strike, the captain's blade glancing harmlessly off the heavy metal. Without missing a beat, Arthur swung the stoker low, aiming for Quoss' shin. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Quoss staggered back with a sharp yelp of pain, his furious expression darkening. "You fuck!" Quoss snarled, his dark eyes flashing with a mix of pain and unbridled rage. "Yield," Arthur commanded, his voice steady, his fire stoker still held in a firm grip. Quoss' gaze flickered to the stoker, then back to Arthur, his expression shifting to one of incredulity. "Are you a lackwit?" Arthur didn't hesitate, turning the captain's words against him with a calm yet biting retort. "Are you?" He nodded toward the door behind Quoss, where one of the Unsullied finished off the last of the captain's guards, Perino and the other Unsullied closing in on them. Quoss' survival instincts kicked in immediately, his eyes snapping toward the door. He made a move to bolt, but Arthur was already blocking his escape. Quoss chuckled nervously, the sound hollow. "Very well, why?" The sentence died on his lips as the hilt of an Unsullied short sword collided with the back of his head, cutting him off as he crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he could even fall. Perino and Arthur exchanged a brief glance, taking in the chaos that still lingered in the room. After a moment, Perino spoke, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "Sir Arthur, you have my eternal thanks for this." Arthur gave a curt nod, his eyes scanning the room. "Don't be so quick to offer your gratitude. There may still be more." "Magister." A voice cut through the tension, and Arthur spun to face the newcomer. It was Morocco's captain of guards, his expression unreadable. "Sir, the assailants have been dealt with. My patrols are sweeping the manse, but it seems we've eliminated all of them. We found 5 dead sellswords by the main gate. None of my men claim to have fought them." Arthur gave a short bow of his head, his voice calm. "That would be my doing." Perino released an impressed noise. "Will you accept my gratitude now, sir?" he said with some cheek. Arthur turned back to the Magister. While his knightly instincts urged him to refuse out of humility, the more pragmatic side of him, the side forged in the fires of the rebellion and sharpened by years of exile, silenced those thoughts. "If we could speak privately?" Arthur suggested, his gaze flicking to the captain of the guards. The Unsullied, true to their discipline, would remain silent, but the Lycian captain was another matter. He could not be trusted with their conversation. Perino inclined his head in agreement. "Of course. Captain, take this unconscious man to a secure room, and keep a guard posted both inside and outside." This man was the leader of the sellsword band. The captain nodded, signaling to another guard, and together, they lifted Quoss, dragging him away. Once they were gone, Arthur wasted no time. His words were precise and urgent. I need you to adopt Jaehaerys. Give him a new name, and if I do not return, wait until he is of age before revealing his true heritage to him. Keep him safe, out of the public eye. If I vanish, no one will believe I would leave his side, perhaps witnesses who testify that Jaehaerys came with me. He paused, thinking deeply. Lysara, as his maid, will make it more believable if she departs with me. Keep Jaehaerys hidden for at least a few years, then you may display him as you magisters are wont to do, as your own son of course. Perino's eyes widened further as Arthur spoke, his words heavy with gravity. Are you sure about this? While rare, attacks like these aren't new to Lysene politics. I'm certain another magister is behind this. Would you truly entrust me with the safety of the young prince? Arthur's gaze hardened, his voice unwavering. I believe it will be for the best. Jaehaerys deserves a future, one that I cannot offer while on the run. Better that I draw attention while he slips away quietly. Perhaps one day I can return to offer him sword lessons, but the gods know when, or even if, that will come to pass. He paused, his expression darkening as a shadow passed over his thoughts. He is the last I have. The last I live for. After. Arthur caught himself before he could continue, realizing he had let his guard slip too far. Such personal thoughts were not for public consumption, especially not now. Perino, for his part, nodded with an understanding expression, a flicker of empathy crossing his features. I may not have children of my own, but I raised my younger sister after our father passed. If anything had happened to her. His voice trailed off for a moment before he gave a firm nod. Very well. I'll adopt the boy and treat him as my own. Arthur felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though a gnawing uncertainty still lingered in the pit of his stomach. He nodded solemnly. Draco Maracos, Perino declared with finality, his voice tinged with solemnity. He will be raised by the finest minds I can find, and, perhaps, under the tutelage of the greatest knight alive. He will grow into a great man. Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered the name. Draco Maracos. The name would work, though Arthur couldn't shake the reluctance to abandon the name given by Jaehaerys' parents. Still, it was for his safety, and Arthur had to make that sacrifice, even if it stung. The decision had been made, but there was another question gnawing at Arthur's thoughts: what next? Where would he go? His thoughts flickered back to Lysara, and he couldn't quite shake the nagging feeling that his desire to have her accompany him on this journey was more than just out of necessity. He had once been a Dornish youth, before being totally loyal to his vows as a king's guard, but those vows seemed so distant now. Could he allow himself to cross lines he'd sworn never to cross? What would Sir Barristan or Sir Gerald say if they knew of his fall from grace? He supposed he had crossed most of those lines now already. What was one more? Christopher tipped his glass of Arbor Gold and drank deeply, his gaze never wavering from the man seated across from him. The visitor's doublet was a rich shade of deep blue, embroidered with the unmistakable sigil of House Redwine, a meticulously stitched cluster of Burgundy grapes that left no doubt as to his lineage. Lord Paxter Redwine, the Lord of the Arbor, was 24, a few years Christopher's senior, yet there was no question as to which of them held the higher station. Still, unlike certain Lord Paramounts in Redwine's homeland, Christopher had no need to wield his authority to affirm his own importance. He preferred to foster an air of mutual respect, framing their meeting as one between equals rather than as a lord entertaining a lesser vassal. That did not mean, however, that Christopher was entirely above her measured display of grandeur. He had personally invited Redwine to River Run for these negotiations, as his new seat was still under construction, progressing swiftly, but far from ready to host guests. At present, it could scarcely accommodate him when he visited the site. How he would have preferred to receive him in Old Stones, a flicker of wistfulness passing through him. Alas! Instead, he had ensured his solar was adorned with calculated embellishments. Behind him hung a great banner bearing the sigil of House Mud, a silent declaration of his heritage and claim. One wall was dominated by a masterful tapestry depicting the legend of Christopher IV, the hammer of justice, his rise, his triumphs, and ultimately, his fall. On the opposite wall, twin ivory tusks from a near-mythical Associ elephant loomed, a gift from a triarch of Volantis upon Christopher's wedding. It had taken 4 men per tusk to mount them, their sheer size and exotic nature drawing the attention of every visitor who set foot in the room. The great windows behind Christopher framed a breathtaking view, the red fork and tumblestone converging beneath the castle's mighty walls, their waters snaking into the distance. Say what one would about the Tullys, but none could fault them for their choice of seat. Across from him, Lord Paxter Redwine set down his own goblet, his fingers drumming idly against the polished wood of the desk between them. "So, you will not move on the payment?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of challenge. "Yet you insist on this non-competition clause for wine? Enlighten me again, why would I want or need this?" Despite the skepticism in his words, Christopher could see the calculation in the Reachman's eyes. He was not far from understanding, nor from a shake of hands. They had been in his solar for closer to 3 hours now, perhaps more. The bulk of their conversation had been filled with lordly small talk, discussions of realm-wide happenings, rumors from beyond the narrow sea, recollections of their youth, and a few tales from the war at Harrenhal. Yet Christopher found himself most drained by the short but far more intense stretch of negotiation. He leaned back slightly, swirling the last of his arbor gold before flashing a cheeky grin. "Well, you see, if I were fortunate enough to acquire a fine navy in such a short time frame as you can provide, at a price, of course, greater than what might otherwise be expected," he let the words hang, watching Paxter's lips raise slightly in amusement at the cheap negotiation tactic. Christopher pressed on, "With such ships, I would finally be able to put my pests down in Saltpans and Maidenpool for good. They've thrived off my lack of proper merchant vessels, sucking me to the bone like the leeches they are." Lord Paxter raised an eyebrow. "And? I am well aware of your troubles, but you seem to have forgotten the part where you convince me what's in this for me. Besides the ships taken off your hands at over-market rate?" Christopher countered, half serious, half playful. 100 ships, Paxter corrected, his tone measured but firm. "Do not let that fact slip your mind. And in my opinion, barely over what they would sell for individually. You must account for maintenance, crews, captains, and docking fees as well. They are not free even after purchase, as I'm sure you know." Christopher took a slow sip of his wine before raising a hand in mock surrender. All right. I am well aware of the costs." He set the glass down and leaned forward slightly, his expression turning shrewd. "Now hear this, the Riverlands have never had much of a wine industry, save for a few ill-fated ventures by ambitious lords or merchants. Not for lack of fertile land or ample sunlight, mind you, but due to unforeseen political consequences, misunderstandings, wars, disruptions of all sorts." He let that hang for a moment before continuing, "Now, however, we are moving into an age of stability. Trade flourishes under my rule. Saltpans and Fairmarket have expanded for the first time since before the first Black Fire Rebellion. It is not only possible but inevitable that a Riverlander wine industry will take root. That is why you should value the non-competition clause." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if the vineyards were already thriving and the barrels of Riverland wine merely waiting to be uncorked. "Oh, last I checked, the majority of wine consumed in your lands comes from my vineyards," Paxter countered, swirling his own cup of arbor gold as if to emphasize the point. Christopher, of course, was well aware of this. It was precisely why he had already begun quietly recruiting experienced vineyard owners from Essos, bringing in their expertise to cultivate a domestic industry. But that was not something Lord Redwine needed to know, he would discover it by himself eventually if he wished to. "A guarantee in the not-so-distant future," Christopher corrected smoothly. "Look at my ascension to hand, an event that reshaped the political landscape overnight. Don't believe your wine dominance is immune to the winds of change. The wise prepare before the storm arrives, Lord Paxter." They sat in silence for a moment as Lord Paxter mulled over Christopher's words, his fingers tapping idly against the rim of his goblet. Christopher could see it, he was close, but not quite there. Redwine was not yet convinced. With a slow shake of his head, Paxter finally spoke. "I'm afraid it's not enough. I empathize with your situation, do not doubt that, and I would offer aid freely were it solely in my power. But I have my own concerns, my own responsibilities. I cannot justify this trade without greater assurances. If there is nothing else, I fear we must consider this matter closed." His voice was firm, his expression reluctant but resolute. Christopher remained still for a moment, calculating. He had been cautious thus far, working with conservative estimates of future revenue and returns. But he knew the truth, this fleet was not merely a luxury, it was a necessity. If he wanted it, he had to be willing to pay the price. His mind raced through the possibilities. As Hand of the King and Lord Paramount, there were things he could promise, things Paxter would not ignore. Exhaling slowly, he rose to his feet. "As a show of good faith, and in the hope of future cooperation and friendship, I will add 5,000 dragons to sweeten the pot." He let the words settle before delivering his final play. "And an initial informal union of our houses if circumstances were to align, to seal the deal." Christopher extended a hand toward the still-seated Lord Redwine. "What do you say, my lord?" Paxter's clear blue eyes flicked from Christopher's extended hand to his face before he finally rose to his feet. For a brief moment, silence hung between them. Then, with a small nod of concession, Paxter clasped Christopher's hand in a firm shake. Relief flickered in Christopher's chest, but he kept his expression measured. The deal was struck, but both men knew the importance of appearances. As if by silent agreement, they released their grip in unison and reached for their goblets of arbor gold. Christopher looked to Paxter for the toast, waiting. The Reachman, now noticeably more at ease, lifted his glass with a pleased expression. To continued wine dominance and new alliances, Christopher let a grin tug at the corner of his lips before raising his own goblet, joining the toast. As the arbor gold slid smoothly down his throat, he held a silent toast of his own. To House Mud. To the Riverlands, once more ruled as they were always meant to be. The autumn sun was still warm, a lingering gift from the summer that had stretched 2 years long. Christopher savored it as his party rode along the disused dirt path, though their horses were far less appreciative. The uneven, neglected track was a clear reminder of yet another thing he would have to address, proper roads leading to his new seat. He could already hear the complaints that would pour in if some highborn lord and lady attempted to travel with a carriage through this mess. For now, a smaller riding party was the wiser choice. Sir Barristan rode at his left, a familiar and reassuring presence at his side. But to his right was a new companion for this particular journey, his cousin, Robin. Robin had been busy maintaining his position in the capital during his periodic absences. Then there was the spy network his cousin operated that worked to supplement the reports Christopher got from Varys. His cousin's unwavering loyalty and sharp instincts had earned him more than mere gratitude. Christopher had granted him the title of Knight of Fieldstone, a fiefdom cradled between the Blue and Green Forks, where they met the Red Fork. Once a personal holding of House Tully, it had now of course ended up in Christopher's hands. The land was far from insignificant, boasting a central position in the Riverlands with the Trident's waters forming a natural boundary on 3 sides. But its potential had long been squandered. It had once been the ancestral seat of House Strong, before they ascended to Harrenhal, and with their focus diverted, Fieldstone had been left to stagnate. Now, all that remained was an ailing keep, untouched since the reign of Jaehaerys the Conciliator, alongside a few scattered villages that were far from thriving. For Christopher, the land held little personal interest beyond what it could provide for his cousin. It was a gift designed to elevate Robin's status, to grant him the prestige that came with land and title, and offer him the chance to establish his own noble line. To further this goal, Christopher had also brokered a marriage between Robin and Alysanne Blackwood, the sister of Tytos Blackwood. Titos had been understandably hesitant at first, reluctant to part with his only sister, even if she should have been married long ago had it not been for the upheaval of the rebellion. The fact that Robin was, in title, only a landed knight did little to ease his concerns. But Christopher, with his characteristic persistence, had eventually persuaded Titos to look beyond titles and see Robin for the man he truly was, a man of honor, capability, and loyalty. Christopher vouched for his cousin's character, assuring Titos that Robin would treat Alysanne with the respect, care, and devotion she deserved. Moreover, the union would finally bind their houses together not just by vows, but by law, a connection that would strengthen their alliance in these uncertain times. Though Robin still wouldn't be a mud, the fact he was Christopher's cousin was not too far off, and considering the alternatives for marriage ties with House Blackwood the only match Christopher would accept. For all that Lord Titos had proven himself as one of Christopher's most loyal vassals, the thought of marrying his firstborn son and heir into the Blackwood family felt like a wasted opportunity. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, the value of such a marriage was diminished when it was tied to a friendly vassal, especially when the potential alliances available to Christopher were far more advantageous. No, Robin and Alysanne had been the perfect match for Christopher. He hoped they would grow to have a long and happy marriage. They were married relatively quickly a few moons ago now. Lady Alysanne being trusted by Robin to lead the efforts to renovate and refurbish their new shared home. "Robin, have you decided on a name yet?" Christopher asked, breaking the silence as they rode along. "For my house?" Robin echoed after a moment, his tone rising as he caught onto Christopher's intent. "I do, actually." "Wonderful," Christopher said, his eyes glinting with curiosity as they rode side by side. "You'll tell me soon enough." "No need to drag it out," he teased, his voice light but with the underlying warmth of genuine interest. Robin smirked before bowing his head in a playful gesture. "I am now Sir Robin of House Stonebank." Christopher nodded approvingly, letting the name settle in for a moment. "The Knight of Fieldstone," he added, considering the title. He paused, rolling the name around in his thoughts, then smiled. "A fine choice, sir. And how is your lady wife?" Robin's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of distraction crossing his face. "Very well. Sarah is close to labor once again, is she not?" Christopher chuckled lightly at the stammer, but chose not to press the matter. "Getting closer by the day," he replied. "I would have ordinarily stayed by her side, but Maester Vyman assured me she has time before the little one arrives. So when Sir Edwin requested my presence, and I was already near River Run, there was little reason to remain in the quiet of the keep. Even Sarah urged me to go, but she insisted I be quick about it." He glanced at his cousin, his grin widening. "It worked out well that you intercepted me, though. I had no time to waste with that command hanging over me." Robin raised an eyebrow, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Oh? Are the rumors about who the true power behind the throne wrong, then?" he teased, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. Christopher's expression wavered between a grin and a grimace as he met his cousin's gleaming eyes. "You already know the answer to that," he replied, his tone half jesting, but masking the deeper truth that Sarah held far more sway over him than anyone else, even now. His wife was no meek lady hidden away behind closed doors. If there was something she cared about, everyone knew it, and that included him. Robin chuckled, clearly unbothered by his jests. "What of your boys then? Tristan and Tristan? We can at least thank the gods they aren't more than half-siblings, or the confusion with their names would be the least of our problems." Christopher's thoughts drifted to his children. He wished he could say that both of his sons were treated equally, but Sarah's feelings toward Tristan remained a delicate and unyielding issue. Understandably, perhaps, Sarah had been hesitant to accept Tristan fully as her own, despite the bond they shared as father and son. Tristan, his natural-born son, had never been cast aside or treated differently. Christopher had made sure of it. Tristan had always been involved in family matters, attended to as any legitimate son would be, but there was an undeniable distance between him and Sarah. The boy, now nearly 5 name days old, was sharp, too sharp not to notice the subtle difference in the way Sarah regarded him. He saw how she doted on Tristan with a warmth Tristan did not receive, no matter how hard Christopher worked to create an equal bond between them. It was a truth that hurt him more than he liked to admit. Even though Christopher made every effort to ensure his sons felt equally loved and important, the walls Sarah had quietly constructed around Tristan remained in place. The child, despite his father's best intentions, felt the coldness, and it was something neither of them could ignore. "They're healthy boys," Christopher said with a fond smile, a hint of longing in his voice. "Tristan is no doubt stirring up some mischief if he hasn't already been punished for his latest stunt, and Tristan is the most pleasant babe, or so the maids say." Both Robin and Barristan chuckled, the King's Guard especially having witnessed his fair share of Tristan's escapades over the years. Sarah's new pregnancy had led her to move back to River Run, just as she had when carrying Tristan, seeking refuge from the exhausting demands of King's Landing. This time, she naturally had Tristan with her, but it was only after more than one heated argument that Christopher had insisted Tristan join them as well, to keep his younger brother company during the journey. "I do wish I could visit more often, but Varys is ever watchful. It's almost a full-time job keeping his network off my trail, sending decoys, carefully revealing only parts of the surface network to keep him oblivious to the true scale of my little project." Before Christopher could respond, his cousin waved a hand dismissively. "Let's not dive back into work talk just yet. I apologize for bringing it up," Robin added, offering a half-smile. Christopher shrugged. "Very well, then. What would you prefer to discuss?" Robin seemed to mull it over for a moment before his gaze turned back to Christopher. "You brought a new Kingsguard knight with you to River Run. What was his name again?" "Sir Edward Yelshire," Christopher replied, a hint of sarcasm creeping into his voice. "An appointment courtesy of Lord Mace. I finally gave in after the 7th time he bemoaned that none of his youngest Hightower nephews were old enough to fill the Kingsguard's slot and represent the Reach in the next generation of knights." They both heard Barristan exhale loudly beside them. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried a weight of distaste. Both Robin and Christopher turned their attention to the Kingsguard knight, who had a slight flush creeping up his neck. "Does this Sir Edward not sit well with you, Sir Barristan?" Robin asked across from Christopher, his curiosity piqued. "Do speak your mind, sir," Christopher urged, sensing Barristan's hesitation. The Kingsguard knight took a moment before responding, his voice steady but firm. "You can tell Lord Tyrell that he doesn't know a damn thing about what makes a good Kingsguard knight," Barristan said bluntly. "He'd do better to work on his own swordplay before meddling in matters beyond his understanding." Robin let out a chuckle. "That is the way of lords and nobles, sir. It's practically their duty to poke their noses into things they know nothing about." "Don't forget that you're one of them now," Christopher reminded him with a smirk. Robin groaned dramatically. "Do not remind me." "Still, you're not wrong. They have an irritating tendency to involve themselves in everything they stumble across," Christopher said with a weary sigh. "You have no idea how many lords have approached me, eager to offer their mentorship, as if I were some green boy in need of pointers in the art of ruling. The esteemed Lord of Greykeep not offering any valuable insight, cousin," Robin quipped, his tone laced with amusement. Christopher responded only with a mock-irritated look, unimpressed by the cheap jest. "Be grateful you did not witness the sycophants of King Aerys, Lord Hand," Barristan said, his tone dry as dust. "Their tongues were already stained brown before they even introduced themselves." Christopher blinked, glancing at Robin to make sure he'd heard correctly. Their eyes met in mutual understanding before both burst into laughter. Where is this mouth usually, Sir Barristan?" Robin finally managed between coughs of laughter. "Do you save it just for boring horse rides?" I said that aloud. "Seven help me, you two are obviously a bad influence," Sir Barristan muttered, though the hint of a smirk betrayed his amusement. Robin chuckled again, clearly enjoying the rare sight of the legendary knight loosening up. "Is that not the keep through the trees there?" Barristan suddenly asked, pointing toward a gap in the canopy where a glimpse of stone peeked through. It should be, Christopher replied, narrowing his eyes in an attempt to gauge how much had changed since his last visit. From this distance, the details were difficult to distinguish, however. The rest of the ride through the forest passed in silence, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves against the dirt path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. Then, at last, the trees thinned, revealing the rebuilt dark-stoned keep of Old Stones. The fortress stood atop one of the few hills in the area, its commanding position offering a natural stronghold. Wooden scaffolding clung to its walls, evidence of ongoing reconstruction, as laborers moved about like ants. At the base of the hill sprawled what was neither fully a workers' camp nor yet a true castle town. Rows of tents and temporary structures clustered together, but here and there, proper houses had begun to take shape, smoke curling from their chimneys. Many of the laborers were former gold cloaks who had accepted his offer of steady work, while others were aimless men plucked from the depths of Flea Bottom and the less fortunate corners of King's Landing. These men knew him by sight and bowed deeply as he passed. The rest were local farmhands, sons sent to earn coin before the final harvest of the year. As they neared the keep, Christopher took note of the newly laid foundations for the courtyard surrounding it. While remnants of the original old stones had remained, his builders had strongly advised him to dig them up and start anew. He had heeded their counsel, though he liked to believe and hope that a few stones of the old castle had found their place in the new. The doors of the keep swung open as they rode up, and a small group of men emerged to greet them. Christopher recognized them immediately. Leading the group was Maester Allard, the castle's maester and the man he had entrusted with overseeing construction in his absence. Beside him strode Sir Edwin Blackwood, brother to Titos, who had accepted Christopher's offer to serve as Castellan of Old Stones. It was his duty to manage the lands surrounding the castle and oversee its daily affairs. Lastly came Brian, the newly appointed captain of the guard. A veteran of the city watch, knighted by him personally, he had once been among Christopher's most trusted captains in the Gold Cloaks. When offered a place in his personal service, Brian had accepted without hesitation, bringing a dozen men with him to form the foundation of Christopher's household guard in Old Stones. His original guards, those who had first sworn themselves to him, were now split between the Tower of the Hand and River Run, serving as sergeants with younger, less experienced men beneath them. It was difficult to believe how much had changed since he had first hired them. Christopher realized he had not often considered what all this must have been like for them. When he'd picked them up as caravan guards from various towns after leaving Sow's Horn, he had expected them to move on when something better came along. Instead, they had followed him through battle, politics, and now into the foundations of something greater. It made him think of ways to reward the ones who had believed in him for so long. "My lord," Maester Allard greeted as their horses slowed to a stop. "Maester, sirs," Christopher replied, greeting the others as well, swinging down from his saddle alongside Robin and Barristan. "How goes the construction?" "Well, my lord," Allard said with a nod. He gestured behind him toward the bustling worksite. "They've begun marking up the perimeter walls. There's been some disagreement over finer details, nothing to trouble yourself over, just craftsmen and their pride. I have confidence in your ability to smooth it over, Maester," Christopher said reassuringly before turning his attention to the two other men. "One more thing, my lord," Maester Allard followed. "A matter of personal interest, I would think." The Maester then pulled forth a missive from his robes. From River Run, it arrived only a short half-hour ago. Christopher exchanged a glance with Robin before taking the offered letter, the seal already broken. It was from Maester Vyman at River Run. His eyes skimmed the parchment, absorbing the words swiftly. Celia Mudd. A girl, with the blonde hair of her mother and green-blue eyes. Sarah was exhausted but in no immediate danger, the Maester assured him. Relief flooded through him, but it was not alone. Happiness, guilt, and fear warred within him in equal measure. Another child. Another daughter. He should have been there. "We were preparing horses to send a party with the letter," Brian said crisply. "If you need them, they're ready for your disposal." Christopher exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the parchment before he nodded. I ride for River Run as soon as possible. I feared as much, Maester Allard sighed. Night will be upon you before long, but I understand the circumstances. At least take an escort. Christopher turned to him. How many horses have you prepared? 4. He nodded. Then I will take one of the guards with me. Both Sir Edwin and Captain Brian opened their mouths to protest, but he raised a hand, cutting them off. Send word to River Run to dispatch fresh horses and riders to meet us on the road if that reassures you. But I will not be slowed by a large entourage. If we push the horses, we may reach River Run by dusk tomorrow. There was a moment of hesitation before Brian gave a reluctant nod. Then I'll see to the preparations immediately. Good, Christopher replied simply. Objectively, he knew it wasn't his fault that he had missed the birth. Sarah had gone into labor weeks early. But that knowledge did little to quell the frustration gnawing at him. If the labor hadn't been unusually fast, then he had left River Run only hours before, half a day at most. The timing was a cruel twist of fate, one that made his absence feel all the more bitter. There was nothing now, however, but to depart as soon as possible. What did it say? Robin suddenly asked. Christopher snapped out of his thoughts, his gaze turning to his cousin. For a moment, he struggled to process what Robin had said before the realization hit him. Sarah had the babe, a girl. Celia. Robin blinked, clearly shocked at first, but that gave way to understanding, followed by an exasperated look. Are you a god, Christopher? Christopher froze, confused. What? His cousin raised an eyebrow, smirking. No? Then why are you blaming yourself for something only the gods could have known? Robin grinned, a touch of humor lacing his words. Congratulations on your daughter, my lord. Are both well? Sir Bereston's voice cut through the moment, his tone as steady as ever. Christopher glanced at him, grateful for the distraction. Yes, he replied, though his voice held a slight edge of uncertainty. Maester Vyman said Sarah is physically well, though exhausted. He mentioned nothing about the babe except that she has her mother's hair. And my eyes. Robin, sensing his cousin's lingering worry, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He wouldn't have left out anything important, Christopher. If the babe were in danger, we'd know. We'll be there by this time tomorrow. There's nothing more to be done now. His voice was steady, calm, exactly what Christopher needed to hear. You are right, Christopher said, trying to convince himself as much as anything. Of course I am, Robin replied, his grin fading slightly. Though the gods have been cruel to you. Christopher's brow furrowed in concern. In what way? Robin's grin reappeared, his tone playful. Well, that they gave one cousin both the looks and the wits, of course. He looked over at Sir Barristan, who was clearly struggling to keep a smile at bay. Christopher sighed dramatically. If you were not my cousin, he began, his voice mock-threatening. Robin feigned innocence. Hey! How can you know my dreams? Christopher just shook his head, refusing to give the jest a response as he heard the sound of hooves approaching in the distance. Within minutes, they were mounted on fresh palfreys, and the small party of 4 was swallowed once again by the dense forest. Christopher felt the weight lift from his shoulders as Robin's words sank in, easing the tightness in his chest. The steady rhythm of the palfrey beneath him and the direction of their journey, toward River Run, toward Sarah and his daughter, gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The nagging sense of helplessness that had gripped him while waiting for the horses faded, replaced by the clarity of action and the knowledge that there was nothing else to do. The waters of the bay glittered in the weak winter sun, flowing as they always had. Yet, Christopher had no desire to take a dip, not in this season. The reason became evident when one turned inland. Though patches of grass still peeked through, the land was largely blanketed in snow. Winter had come to Westeros. The White Raven had arrived in King's Landing a moon ago, marking the end of 285 AC and the beginning of the 286th year since Aegon's conquest. When Christopher had explained to his 2-year-old son that the snowfall signaled winter's arrival, Benjamin Stark had let out a loud snort, telling them all that this wouldn't even be considered a light summer snow in Winterfell. Christopher had quipped back that not all men were stubborn enough to remain in lands so often ravaged by brutal winters. Benjamin had simply replied that such hardship bred hard men. To be fair, this winter seemed mild for the Riverlands. Even in harsher years, they were rarely buried under snow and storms like the north, but they still received a steady snowfall, enough to pose challenges. Christopher pushed thoughts of the weather aside and turned his attention to the man riding at his right. Lord Jason Mallister, the ruler of Seaguard, was tall and lean, his brown hair framing a face set with fierce grey eyes. His sharp gaze only reinforced the first impression of a capable and strong-willed lord. He was also the man from whom Christopher had effectively reclaimed land when he restored the ancestral holdings of Housemud at Old Stones. For centuries, the Mallisters had patrolled those lands, and petitioners had brought their troubles to Seaguard. Though the territory had belonged to House Tully on paper, in practice, it had long been under Mallister influence. Yet when Christopher reasserted his claim over the hills, woods, and marshes divided by the Blue Fork, Lord Jason had acknowledged that the law was on his side. That did not mean he was pleased about it. Not only that, but Lord Jason had fought alongside Lord Tully at the Second Battle of the Trident, holding the line until his liege fell and Baratheon fled, surrendering only when there was no other choice. Christopher had worked since then to bring House Mallister firmly under his rule. In times of peace, the Mallisters had been among House Tully's strongest and most reliable vassals. Winning their loyalty was no small task. He had taken a step toward goodwill by securing a place for Lord Jason's uncle in the Kingsguard, an honor not easily ignored. Yet, while this gesture had softened tensions, it had not turned Lord Jason into an ally. At best, the man had moved from skepticism to neutrality. Still, he had not rejected Christopher's invitation to discuss a proposal, one that could bring them both great benefits. "The canal will flow out into the bay directly in front of us," Christopher said, gesturing toward the shoreline. "I've had surveyors examining nearly every stretch of land between Old Stones and the bay for the past half-year. They found a lighter layer of soil beneath our feet, extending all the way to the bay, making excavation relatively easy." Lord Jason followed his movements with a skeptical gaze. "This descent looks more like the makings of a waterfall than a gentle slope fit for a river," he remarked, glancing down at the rising terrain behind them. Christopher inclined his head. "A challenge that has delayed this project for 2 years now, and a valid concern." His tone, however, remained steady, untroubled. Lord Jason took notice. "But you have a solution, it seems?" "Indeed, we do," Christopher replied. "Several aspiring maesters from the Riverlands never earned their chains, homesickness got the better of them. But while they were at the Citadel, they witnessed and studied a most ingenious solution to our elevation problem." "How fortunate," Lord Jason said dryly, though the skepticism in his eyes was now tempered with curiosity. "Yes," Christopher said simply before continuing. "The Citadel, as the greatest repository of knowledge in Westeros, both purchases and receives books and writings from the farthest corners of the world. Our homesick half-maesters eventually came across a few Yi-Tish historical texts. One in particular, Loshi, described a structure called a lock, an ingenious mechanism that allows ships to be raised or lowered between rivers of differing elevations." He allowed the words to settle before adding, "They are eager to put this knowledge into practice. They've drawn up at least a dozen designs, which currently litter my solar in River Run. However, I have the latest iteration with me." Reaching into his saddlebag, Christopher pulled out a rolled parchment and handed it to Lord Mallister. The Lord took the offered plans, studying them with evident interest. Christopher continued as he examined the design. "The concept is straightforward, an open-air chamber with gates on either end. By controlling the flow of water in and out, the chamber can raise or lower a ship, allowing it to traverse the elevation and through repeated steps reach the canal system. From there, it would flow into the Blue Fork and eventually the Trident." Lord Jason traced the illustrations with his eyes, absorbing the carefully labeled diagrams. A fascinating idea, he admitted at last, handing the parchment back. Christopher tucked the plans safely into his saddlebag, already considering how best to counter Mallister's lingering skepticism. "Still, you doubt it?" Christopher eventually asked, his tone edged with challenge. "Do you think it nothing more than a fanciful dream?" Lord Jason remained unmoved. "Even the best-laid plans can prove impractical, or outright impossible, for any number of reasons. I will not blindly invest my coin and attention in a mere dream." "A wise habit," Christopher acknowledged with a nod. "Perhaps, then, you'd prefer to discuss the part of this proposal that interests you more?" "Indeed," Jason agreed. "For instance, where exactly will this arsenal be located?" "There," Christopher said, pointing toward a seemingly unremarkable patch of snowless grass at the bay's edge. "As you can see, it's surrounded by trees that can be used immediately for construction. The keep will be positioned between it and the canal, allowing for a swift response to any attack on either, or both." He glanced at Jason before adding, "Was all this not detailed in the plans I sent you?" "I've read through it," Jason said, his gaze sharp, "but I wanted to hear it from your own mouth as well. You do realize this entire project is ambitious, to say the least? I don't even want to think about the cost." Christopher met his look without hesitation. "Lord Lannister's reparations will cover about a fourth of it. In addition, the Crown considers this a project of realm-wide importance and has agreed to contribute half of what Lord Lannister is providing. Lord Tyrell has personally committed to matching the Crown's share in exchange for discounted fees for ships flying Reachman colors. As for timber, Lord Stark has been persuaded to supply enough for the entire project in return for no more than 10 cogs built within 5 years of the arsenal's completion." "How generous," Jason remarked dryly, still unconvinced. "Yet you still seem to be missing a considerable sum." "The Crown is negotiating with the Iron Bank for a loan to cover 4/10 of the cost. That leaves about a tenth to be shouldered by the Riverlands. With the agreement of Sir Quincy Cox, Lord Mouton, and Lord Went, that remainder is now divided between them and House Mudd's coffers." Jason raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to pitch in as well?" "For a share of the profits, yes," Christopher replied firmly. "And only for a set number of years. The exact terms can be negotiated, but it will not be indefinite." "Let me be direct, then," Lord Jason said, his tone firm. "What will you do when a fleet of ironborn longships sails into the bay, slaughtering and enslaving every worker they can find? Will you simply replace the men and resume work, or will you abandon the project entirely?" "Neither," Christopher replied without hesitation. "I've already spoken with our Master of Ships, Lord Velaryon, about stationing roughly half of the royal fleet in this very bay, and, hopefully, at Seaguard as well." His voice carried quiet confidence. For now, the arrangement was only secured for a year, far from enough to cover the entire construction period. But Christopher was certain he could either extend the agreement or find an alternative before the time was up. Regardless, this was not anything Lord Mallister needed to know now. Lord Jason's surprise was evident, though it was quickly joined by satisfaction. He immediately grasped the significance of such a deployment, a powerful deterrent against any ironborn incursion for as long as the fleet remained. For all their pride and ferocity, even the ironborn would think twice before challenging half of the royal fleet outright. "And will I be the one footing the bill for this stationing?" Lord Jason asked, his sharp gaze unwavering. There was little that escaped his notice. "I would think shouldering half the cost would be a fair compromise, considering the protection they will provide to these lands," Christopher replied evenly. "As for the specifics of payment, whether through taxes or other means, we can settle those details later." "You seem to have thought of many answers, my lord," Lord Jason admitted, his expression betraying a hint of approval. Christopher met his gaze evenly. "I knew I'd be speaking to a lord who values more than just glory or bragging rights, one who prefers details and sees the value in proper investments." Lord Jason chuckled softly. "You have a way with words, my lord. Whether they carry true weight remains to be seen. Leaning forward slightly, he continued, "This keep you mentioned, have you given thought to who will hold it?" Christopher nodded, though his answer remained measured. "I've considered several options, but I have no definitive answer yet." He met Jason's gaze. "What I am certain of is that a castellan or commander will oversee it in its early years, at least until any lingering threats, ironborn or otherwise, are accounted for. I realize the keep sits quite centrally within your lands, Lord Jason, but I'm afraid it will not be held solely by House Mallister." Jason's expression remained neutral, though Christopher could tell he was waiting to hear the reasoning behind this decision. That patience, that willingness to listen, was something Christopher appreciated. "This keep will be a jewel of the Riverlands, one of its greatest assets, like the Reaches farmlands or the Rocks gold mines," Christopher continued. "For that reason, I do not wish for old feuds or disputes to cloud its protection. Its guardians must be chosen with the realm's stability in mind." Then, as if offhandedly, he added, "That said, I understand your cousin has recently been blessed with a daughter. My congratulations to him and your house." Jason's brow lifted slightly before he inclined his head. "And to you as well. Little Celia, correct?" he asked with a polite smile. "No child better behaved, the maids tell me," Christopher said with a chuckle. Tristan, however, is shaping up to be a rather spirited soul. Their eldest son had been driving Sarah to despair with his boundless energy, only slowing down when near Christopher, or, much to his wife's chagrin, Tristan. While Sarah disapproved, Christopher found it rather heartwarming that his two sons had bonded so well. Jason smirked knowingly. "I see. And tell me, do I smell the makings of a betrothal in all this?" He asked the question directly, steering the conversation back to the heart of the matter. "While I have yet to decide on the lord who will hold the castle," Christopher began, meeting Jason's gaze steadily, "I would have your cousin's daughter be its lady and the mother of a new Riverlander house." He let the words settle before adding, "So while it may not bear the Mallister name, it will always carry Mallister blood." Lord Jason remained silent for several moments, his expression thoughtful. "You bring an interesting proposal, my lord." Christopher leaned in slightly, pressing his advantage. "Is it interesting enough? Consider this, the Riverlands have not seen a transformation of this magnitude in centuries, if ever. This will happen, with or without your cooperation. The real question is whether you wish to reap the rewards and take your place in a stronger, more prosperous Riverlands." His voice carried quiet conviction as he continued, "A Riverlands that the other kingdoms will see as a true power in the realm, not just a battlefield to be trampled or a prize to be carved up for their own gain." Lord Jason's lips curled into a small smile, and there was something akin to respect in his eyes. "You certainly seem to believe your own words." Christopher simply nodded, letting the statement stand on its own. The Mallister lord took a few moments longer, his gaze drifting over the landscape as if trying to picture the future Christopher had painted. "You're not wrong," he admitted at last. "The Riverlands have long remained stagnant." He exhaled slowly before continuing. "Still, few men could have convinced me of this plan, even if they presented it in the exact same way. But you? You are one of those few." Jason turned back to him, eyes sharp with appraisal. "The whole realm has had its eyes on you since you became Hand. Some expected your downfall, others hoped for it. I'll admit, I didn't think you would last longer than any Hand since Lord Tywin. And yet, here you stand, full of ambition, backed by gold, and driven by purpose." Then, without hesitation, he extended his hand toward Christopher. Christopher met Jason's blue-grey eyes as they shared a firm handshake, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, with a sharp whistle, he signaled one of his servants from the entourage. The man approached with measured steps, carrying something with deliberate care. A shovel. Christopher took it from the servant's hands and turned back to Lord Jason, a small smile playing at his lips. "To mark this historic moment, I would have you break the ground, the first of many who will shape this canal." Lord Jason took the offered shovel, the flicker of appreciation in his eyes revealing that he understood the weight of the gesture. With steady hands, the Mallister lord drove the blade into the cold earth. A firm press of his boot sent it deeper, cutting through the cold soil. Then, with a decisive lift, he turned over the first mound of dirt, the first stroke in what would change the Riverlands in irreversible ways. The air was cold and damp, thick with the scent of dust and stone. The only light came from the lantern Varys carried, its flickering glow casting long, wavering shadows against the ancient walls. Maegor had not designed these tunnels with comfort in mind, and after more than 2 centuries, time had done little to soften their harshness. When Varys had first discovered them 2 years ago, he had been genuinely pleased in a way he had not been for years now. The tunnels granted him unparalleled access to the Red Keep, the city's many hidden corners, and even Maegor's holdfast itself, all without fear of detection. What had once required careful maneuvering, whispered words in darkened halls, and his little birds scurrying unseen through corridors was now made infinitely easier. His spies no longer relied solely on shadows and luck, they now moved through the hidden veins of the castle, gathering whispers that would never have reached his ears before. Already, he had uncovered the uncomfortable truths of over half the Crownlander lords, their vices, their ambitions, their weaknesses. Every secret was meticulously recorded and copied twice over, one set sent to Illyrio, a safeguard against unforeseen misfortune, and the other hidden within the anonymous buildings Varys had quietly acquired throughout King's Landing. A reliable system. Power was not merely in whispers but in the assurance that those whispers could never be silenced. Should someone stumble upon one of his caches, they would be hard-pressed to locate the others, let alone account for the copies stored safely within Illyrio's manse. No, these secrets were his alone to wield, to keep, to destroy, or to expose. Tonight, it was the latter that occupied his mind. Christopher Mudd, Hand of the King, Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, had proven as difficult to manipulate as Varys had anticipated. The man was shrewd, pragmatic, and not nearly as susceptible to the usual pressures as others in his position had been. More frustrating still, Varys was certain that the Hand's cousin's brothel network was far more sophisticated and extensive than he had initially believed. Varys had uncovered fragments of the operation over the years, pieces he had once believed to be its whole. In hindsight, they had been too amateurish, careless messages, poorly concealed movements, whispers left just audible enough to be caught. It had all been a distraction, a carefully woven illusion designed to keep him chasing shadows while the real network remained untouched. He was both impressed and indignant. Those arrogant fools. No, he could not even call them that. He had been the fool, allowing his own assumptions to cloud his vision. He had believed them to be ignorant, immature, and inexperienced. And because they had seemed to confirm those assumptions, he had stopped looking deeper. The secret passages had granted Varys access to nearly every corner of the Red Keep, save for one. The Tower of the Hand remained stubbornly elusive. His little birds had discovered a tunnel that led to its foundation and provided entry, but no further. Inside, only the known servants' passages remained, and Christopher's men patrolled with near-paranoid diligence. Guards changed shifts with deliberate overlap, ensuring there was never even a moment's lapse in security. It was almost excessive. And yet, it left the Tower of the Hand a blind spot for him. Varys had attempted more traditional means of infiltration, gold in a willing palm, whispered promises to pliant ears, but Mudd's men proved unyielding. The first guard offered a bribe had immediately reported it. Varys' man had been seized, questioned, and run for every last drop of information. Fortunately, the man had known only what he had been given, a Dornish merchant with a heavy purse and vague instructions. Varys' hand remained hidden, but it was clear now, bribes would not work alone. A distant glow flickered ahead, growing steadily as Varys neared. He extinguished his lantern with a practiced breath, plunging himself into near darkness. When he emerged from the tunnel, the Blackwater Bay stretched before him, its surface barely touched by the sliver of moonlight overhead. The exit led to a secluded beach, shielded by thick foliage and flanked by jagged terrain where few, if any, would tread. Towering stone walls enclosed the cove, casting deep shadows that swallowed the land beneath them. Resting against the rocks was a single rowboat, its hull painted in dark hues and tipped over to blend seamlessly with the surrounding stone. Varys was not a man of physical labor, far from it, but he had arranged things carefully. With a measured push, he rolled the boat upright, then guided it across the sand, its wooden frame whispering against the shore as he eased it into the bay's calm waters. Jumping in, he settled himself swiftly, his hands moving with practiced ease as he slid the oars into their respective forks. The only thing left now was to row. Varys dipped the oars into the water, the gentle splash swallowed by the vast silence of the bay. He pulled steadily, keeping his stroke smooth and measured, ensuring minimal noise. Each stroke carried him farther from the hidden shore. It was one of his favorite sights as King's Landing's lights and the looming form of the Red Keep against the dark sky shrunk as he rowed away. His next attempt to infiltrate the Hand's Tower had been more methodical. He had carefully groomed attendants, training them for months to slip unnoticed into the ranks of Tristopher mud servants and guards. It had taken nearly a year to cultivate 3 candidates, loyal, competent, and utterly convinced of their roles. When the next opening in the Hand's staff appeared, they applied. One by one, they advanced through the selection process, passing interviews and vetting with ease. Then, they vanished. No trace, no bodies, no whispers of their fate. A few weeks later, the positions they had vied for were filled by unfamiliar faces, men and women Varys had no influence over. All his meticulous planning had been erased as if it had never existed. He didn't know for certain what had gone wrong, but he had his suspicions. Sir Robin Stonebank, as he called himself now, had either woven a near-total intelligence network throughout the capital, or he and his men had stumbled onto Varys' scheme by sheer dumb luck. Either possibility was troubling. For weeks, Varys lived in quiet paranoia, watching for signs that his own network had been compromised. He expected to be exposed, to be confronted, to hear whispers in the corridors of the Red Keep about his dealings. Yet nothing came. The council meetings continued as if all was normal. Tristopher Mud showed no sign of suspicion, no mention of spies uncovered, no tightening of security beyond what was already in place. It was as though his failure had been noted, and then dismissed. While his agents had been undergoing training, Varys had also been preparing a final contingency plan: assassination. If he could not manipulate the Hand and his cousin, he would remove them from the board entirely. He had set his plan in motion with precision, having the daily movements of both men studied down to the smallest detail. He had secured weapons within the Red Keep itself, bribed key individuals to look the other way at the crucial moment. It had all been proceeding as intended, until disaster struck. A gold cloak raid hit the safehouse his agents had been using. Every conspirator was captured before they could act. Their heads now adorned the spikes along Traitor's Walk. Varys had kept his distance, ensuring that no ties could be traced back to him. He had not recruited the assassins directly but had nudged the right people, a band of Stormlander rebels, still seething with hatred over the fall of Stannis Baratheon and the exile of their so-called king. Their thirst for vengeance had made them too predictable. This time, Varys at least had the version of events that Tristopher had shared with the council. The Master of Laws, Randall Tarley, who had been ended Sir Robin's interim position 2 years ago, had pressed for more details. The gold cloaks, after all, fell under his command on paper, though he had appeared just as uninformed as the rest. The story came from Gold Cloak Captain Lucas Stone, who claimed to have been tipped off about a suspicious group of Stormlanders. Acting swiftly and independently, he had managed to catch them off guard, only later submitting a detailed report of the operation. Varys could not shake his unease. Who had provided the tip? An agent of Sir Robin, perhaps? Or just another informant on the City Watch's payroll? The answer eluded him, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. As he reflected on the situation, his eyes scanned the horizon, and it was then that he saw his destination. A shadowed shape loomed in the distance, barely visible against the night, anchored by a small shoal just off the coast. Varys maneuvered his rowboat toward the vessel, a galley, recognizing it by its distinctive outline. He guided the boat carefully up beside the ship and spotted a lone rope ladder hanging over the side. Fastening his rowboat to the ladder, he then begins his climb. It was tiring and completely unfamiliar to his usual routine, but Varys had little choice. He gritted his teeth and ascended, each step a slow and deliberate effort. By the time he reached the railing, his arms burned from exertion, and his breath came in quiet, measured huffs. A hand appeared, weathered and calloused, offering assistance. Varys hesitated for only a moment before accepting it. The deck was dimly lit, the crew barely acknowledging his presence as he steadied himself. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the creaking of wood underfoot. Then, from the shadows, a voice he had not heard since before the rebellion cut through the silence like a blade. Deep, measured, authoritative. "Varys, the spider." Varys turned, his face betraying nothing. A figure emerged into the dim glow of a lantern swaying from the mainmast. The flickering light danced over a fine red doublet, the golden lion stitched proudly upon the breast. His bushy side whiskers caught the glow, leaving no room for doubt. Varys bowed his head slightly, his voice smooth as ever. "Lord Tywin, it has been too long." Tywin Lannister regarded him coolly, expression unreadable. "I am sure you have been beside yourself in my absence," he replied dryly. "Yet here we are, summoned to a meeting of such discretion." Varys clasped his hands together, the very image of deference. "I have always valued discretion, my lord. As do you, I suspect, given your choice of arrival." Tywin's sharp gaze did not waver. "I did not sail under cover of night for idle chatter. Speak plainly." "Very well," Varys said smoothly, reaching into his robes. "I now have in my possession the complete financial state of the crown and its treasury for the 287th year after Aegon's conquest." He withdrew a small bundle of neatly stacked papers and extended them toward Tywin. The Lannister lord took them without hesitation, his keen eyes scanning the pages with practiced efficiency. The dim lantern light cast shifting shadows over his face as he flipped through the reports, absorbing their contents in silence. "I see," Tywin finally said, his voice as controlled as ever. His lips twitched, just a fraction, but enough for Varys to notice. "These are illuminating." He turned another page, then folded the stack with deliberate care. "You have brought me some very interesting reports, ones that will no doubt prove useful in the days to come." A pause. His green eyes flicked up from the papers, fixing Varys with an unreadable stare. If there was nothing else? Varys stifled a sigh, his gaze flickering toward the hanging rope ladder in the distance. He should have known better than to expect pleasantries from Lord Tywin in such a setting. Business was business, and the lion's temper was as sharp as ever. "Of course," Varys said, his voice smooth, betraying none of his frustration. "But I am sure your person of interest on Dragonstone would find these reports most enlightening as well." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, then shifted his attention back toward the ladder that led to freedom. Lord Tywin's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "Let me handle my matters, and you handle yours, Spider," he replied curtly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Until we meet again, my lord," Varys said, his voice silky as he had always practiced, before climbing over the railing. Neither expecting nor receiving a reply. His mind was already plotting the next step. If he couldn't dismantle the man in power, then he would bring down the very foundation on which Mud stood, the king who upheld him. And as fortune would have it, a pretender lay just beyond his reach, anchored in the same bay, ripe for manipulation. Mud had risen through rebellion, how poetic that he would fall through the next one.